Hi, everybody. My name is Timo Heister. I'm an associate professor at Clemson University, and I am going to talk to you about a finite element library called deal.II and what it has to do with p4est. That's kind of the high-level pitch. Before I get started with this, I would like to ask you to help me out by posting in the chat. I'm making a very simple survey. So what I would like to know is, on a scale from 0 to 5, whether you are comfortable using C++. Just type in the chat. It's not going to grade you on anything. I just would like to know where you are with C++ and whether I have to explain templates and things like that. Okay, so I see a couple of 5s. I see a few 2s. I don't see a 0. I see a 1 here, so somebody has little experience. That's fine as well. I will go over some source code in the second half of this, and I will point out the things that you need to understand in C++, but I think you should be able to at least follow along what the code does without being an expert in C++. The second question that I have is, there's a thing called the finite element method. And again, from a scale from 0 to 5, never seen it before. 5, you're an expert, you're a professor in mathematics, and you teach the finite element method. Okay. This is, I have to admit, a lot higher than what I was expecting, but that's good. I have 1 or 2 slides about the finite element method, and so for those of you who are not seeing the chat, I see very few 2s and everything is 3 to 5. So most of you know how the finite element method works. This is great. So thank you for that information. I will know how to proceed today, and I will also know how to proceed on Thursday when I have the second and the third part of my presentation. And I'm also already telling you now, if there are specific things I should cover next on Thursday, let me know, and I will try to incorporate these things. And with that, I'm going to get started. If I figure out how to share my screen again. Okay. Screen sharing has started. Okay, I'm starting with slides, and I'm going to also do a demo in, I don't know, about half an hour. I will do a demo, and then we can see how far we get. Okay, so a little bit about myself, and so that you know who I am. So I'm at Clemson University in South Carolina, and I've been here since 2013. Originally, I'm also born in Germany, and I studied in Göttingen and got my PhD there. And that was in 2011. And this is why this is kind of a personal story of what I'm going to talk about today. Namely, the topic of my PhD thesis was more or less, how do I couple deal.II and p4est? So I worked with Karsten and with some other colleagues on this, and this was kind of one of the big pieces of my PhD thesis. And while I was a postdoc at Texas A&M for 2 years, after that, I also continued to work on this. And even today, I'm still working on things related to p4est and deal.II and parallel computing. So what I'm going to try to do is tell you what was it like before I did my PhD thesis on this topic, what it was like in 2011 when this was done, and then kind of go to today and how deal.II looks today and how we interface with p4est and how all of this works. Before I get started, rough plan. I'm going to very roughly, in 5 minutes, tell you what finite element simulations are, why they're important and how they work. I'm going to tell you about deal.II, and I will also show you how to use it. Today, a very simple toy example. And on Thursday, we are actually going to solve PDEs to look at them. And of course, I'm talking here in this p4est school because internally, deal.II uses p4est for parallel mesh partitioning. Again, I have some demonstrations and I have some exercises, and you can do the exercises by yourself. If you have questions, I'm also happy to help with them. My current plan is to actually go over the exercises and the results in the third presentation, which is on Thursday, the last slot. If you are interested in it, I can also cover other topics. And like I hinted at a minute ago, I will also tell you a little bit what happened between 2011 and today. It's been close to 10 years, and a few things have changed since then. But I think it's kind of interesting that I will do the first demo, and you will see basically where we were integrating p4est nearly 10 years ago. And then I will build from there afterwards. So that's the plan. So I've mentioned deal.II a couple of times. This is a C++ open source finite element library. It's available at deal.II.org. It is a community project, so we develop in the open. There's a large number of contributors, and I am one of the 11 maintainers. When I started out, that was during my PhD studies, I was one of 3 maintainers, and we have since grown quite a bit in the library. And it is, I would say, one of the most widely used finite element libraries in the scientific community, at least. We are collecting papers that use and cite deal.II. So not only deal.II is a finite element library citation, but actually doing computations with deal.II. And we currently have over 1,400 scientific papers. That also includes PhD theses and so on that use deal.II over the last couple of years. And to give you a little bit of background, I think what deal.II is most known for is excellent documentation and examples. There are now around 70 well-documented tutorial programs, and I will introduce you to 2 of them, basically. And but there's a lot of stuff you can learn and you can do. There's support for many kinds of finite element types. So there's the standard continuous high-order finite elements, but there's also support for discontinuous Galerkin, so you can do also first-order problems, similar to what problems are done using solved, for example, with forest claw, where you have first-order problems like Euler flow, etc. You can use lowest-order DG for that, or also high-order DG. And there's many kinds of elements that you can combine. And we obviously do adaptive mesh refinement, right? Otherwise, I wouldn't be using p4est. And we do this in 1D, 2D, and 3D. And on hexahedral meshes, of course. You know all that already, because otherwise we wouldn't be using p4est. For linear algebra, there is, especially for parallel linear algebra, for sequential, we also have other options. But for parallel linear algebra, we interface to p4est. You have heard about p4est yesterday, if I understand it correctly, or to Trilinos, which is another library developed at Sandia National Lab, which is also well known for linear algebra and a lot more stuff. And we also do matrix-free computations where we do our linear algebra ourselves in parallel. And this is kind of the last part today of my presentation. The examples that I showed today, and probably also on Thursday, are not going to be matrix-free, unless you're curious about it. But they will use p4est or Trilinos for the linear algebra. And yeah, we have a heavy focus on performance, right? So we are writing it on C++. Things are templated to be very efficient, and we use vectorization, multi-threading, and MPI for high-performance computing to actually be able to compute on some of the largest supercomputers. And I highlighted in blue what is kind of my area of interest in the deal.II library. And it happened that over the years, I've been mostly working on things related to parallel linear algebra. How do you do adaptive refinement for specific problems, and then applying it to different kind of applications or problems. So that is what is deal.II. And just to give you some impression of the things that deal.II can do, I'll start with some examples that come. Actually, these are pictures that I made because these are projects that I was involved in. So during my PhD studies, I worked on turbulent flow. So on the top left, this is a turbulent channel flow that I computed using deal.II when I had the first MPI parallel computations going over 10 years ago. On the top right, there's a project I did for chemically reacting laminar flames. So there's chemical reactions going on, a nonlinear problem to compute the shape of a flame like this. In the bottom left, I've been doing solid mechanics problems. So here's an adaptive refinement strategy, how to do crack propagation. So you have a piece with an initial crack, and then you pull on the top upwards, and then you have a crack forming, which is here done using a phase field method, where you can see the blue region means the material is broken. So the novel thing I was doing there is, how can I do adaptive finite elements for this, and how can I do this in parallel and large scale? And at the bottom right, last but not least, is a code I have been working on also for about 10 years, and it has been the main push for deal.II on how to do large scale and why we need large scale computations. So this is a finite element code built on deal.II. It's called Aspect. It's also open source, and it's used in the geodynamics community to solve problems related to Earth. And so this is a global convection model. It's an adaptive computation here. So you see temperature contours in 3D. This has a couple 100 million of unknowns and that we are computing with, and that uses p4est under the hood. And I will show a few more examples related to Aspect during this presentation. If you're curious about it, I can also tell you more, but I think it suffices to say that these problems are difficult to solve, and we need adaptivity for these. You can probably see that they are very fine features, and to resolve them, you actually need mesh adaptivity. These are examples that I've been involved in, among others, but there's other examples, and you can see here in parentheses actually the tutorial program numbers. So on the top left is step 69, which is an Euler flow example, uses p4est under the hood. On the top right is a coupled fluid structure interaction problem, which is in a little bit extended version of step 70. You see it as a combined 2 different meshes, particle tracking, massively parallel with p4est. And this is actually a simulation a colleague of mine did. This is a ventilator, and this was an experimental study in Italy that was involved with the current COVID-19 situation. So there's actually new and relevant stuff. Research going on that uses p4est under the hood. And I would also like to mention the example here. What you see here is a piece of the hull of a ship. You can see it that this is the front part of the ship here. And this actually uses the boundary element method and is based on step 54. And the cool thing here is that the geometry itself is basically comes from a CAD surface using Open Cascade, and we actually compute on this surface precisely. That comes from an engineer who designs that ship, and then a colleague of mine does boundary element computations on this for the flow around this ship to optimize the shape of the hull, right? So you can understand that you can optimize the shape of this hull to give less water resistance, for example, to save fuel. And that's an industry project that's going on. And step 54 doesn't use p4est because it's a sequential example, but the full-fledged application uses p4est under the hood for these computations as well. So there's a wide breadth of example problems that use deal.II, and hopefully gives you some understanding of the breadth of projects, from engineering, from physics, from numerical method development, and all kinds of other areas. That's the motivation on why deal.II exists and why I work on it and how I apply it to different problems. So I have 2 or 3 slides for PDEs, and most of you have seen PDEs before, so I actually don't have to go into too much detail here. The standard example that people show is the Laplace problem, right? So the Laplace, when solving PDEs, you always solve for unknown functions in a domain. So for example, here I solve for a function u that depends on x and y. It might be post, for example, on the unit square here, given a right-hand side f, and you want to find the function u with the Laplace or a negative Laplace of u equal to f. And this models a membrane deformed by gravity, thermal conduction, all kinds of other very simple problems. And it's the prototype for a PDE that is amenable to the finite element method. So the simplest elliptic problem to write down, but it's also a very hard problem to solve if you put things together in a large-scale parallel computation. And for discretization, well, you have to go to a finite dimensional space, and the simplest thing is you have a mesh, and then on each mesh you construct piecewise polynomials, you glue them together to make global finite element basis functions, and then eventually you have a basis of n finite element functions, right? So for example, you could have linear finite elements on all of these little squares here, and then you have one shape function for each vertex, right? So then your basis is as many vertices as you have, and then you can describe any function as a linear combination of these basis functions. That's the simplest version. Of course, you can do higher order polynomials, etc., and other kinds of function spaces. This is very simplified. So here's a picture from Aspect. So it's just a 2D simulation. It is symmetric. And on the right, you see overlaid the adaptively refined mesh. You see the bottom part here is the core of Earth, several thousand kilometers down. And this is the crust here on the top. This is where we live. And convection in Earth is happening as we speak. Basically, we have a very hot core, and that heats up material at the very bottom. You can think of putting a pot of water on the stove and turning it on, right? The water at the bottom gets heated up, and then it bubbles and forms these circulating patterns. So you have plumes rising up that are hot, and you have plumes going down that are cold. And these form these convective patterns, right? And the PDE behind this is quite complicated to solve, obviously, right? So I have velocities, pressures, temperatures. I have changing viscosities in my material. And you can see that it is very attractive to use adaptive mesh refinement here, right? So we have a time-dependent simulation. Every couple of time steps, I'm going to call into p4est. I want these cells refined. I want these cells coarsened. Please repartition the mesh. Please balance. Give me a 2-to-1 balance. I need this for my computations. And then continue on to run a couple more time steps. And then you can see these plumes rising and simulating this. This all works with finite elements, right? And it's an extension of this simple thing that I told you here. To summarize how you would do it for the Laplace problem is you start with the so-called strong form, multiply by a test function v, integrate by parts. So this parentheses here is an inner product that involves integrating the two terms over the domain. And then you plug in your representation of your basis function. You manipulate the equations a little bit, and you end up with a linear system of equations where you solve for coefficients u, that is the coefficient in front of the shape function phi I that we defined 2 slides ago. So in summary, I can cook down solving a PDE using the finite element method if I do all my steps, if I have a mesh, if I have a finite element space, to solving a linear system of equations. And now you can ask, well, how can I actually do these in parallel, right? So you learned about p4est, you know about parallel computing. So now the question remains as well, how do I solve linear systems in parallel? And how do I do all the other steps? How I define my global numbering of basis functions, and how do I make this work? Okay, before I continue about parallel FEM, is there anything that I need to answer at this point? It looks like there's no question in the chat, so that is good. So I will continue. Okay, so I need to solve linear systems. And the problems are that it is realistic to have linear systems with millions to billions of unknowns. And it's all implicit, right? So I have to solve a linear system. There's no simple updates that I can do for a discontinuous finite volume method, for example, where I don't actually have to solve linear systems. And I might need to do thousands of time steps. So in each time steps, I have to solve linear systems. I might even have nonlinear systems of equations where I have to solve several times to solve these linear systems. And Well, single computers are not getting faster, right? So I need to go parallel. It's kind of obvious. This is the cluster that we have that I can run on. The 5,000 cores is not really true. It's 50,000 something cores. But anyways, but the largest computers have millions of cores, right? You're probably aware of that. I will simplify my life a little bit today, and I will assume MPI. I don't have to explain how MPI works to all of you, because you know how it works, but I will not talk about SIMD vectorization. I'm not going to talk about multi-threading within a node. We're just going to do MPI only, and this is also the default of the examples that I'm showing you later on, is that we just use MPI. If I have several cores in one computer, I can just run several processes on one node. And some of the results that I will be showing later were run on Frontera, and that has 400-something thousand CPU cores. So you might be aware of this, but this is something that I learned when I started out writing parallel code, is you need to pay attention to distributed data storage. You cannot duplicate information. I cannot duplicate my mesh on every processor. I cannot duplicate the whole finite element space with all basis functions to all processors. I cannot duplicate even a solution vector, right? If I have billions of unknowns, then a solution vector by itself is tens or hundreds of gigabytes big. And I cannot even store a solution vector. I cannot store a matrix, right? Of course. And I need algorithms that do not depend on the total problem size, but depend on the local problem size that the individual processor is using. And the last point is also quite obvious if you have done any kind of parallel computing, is that you have to localize and hide communication. So hide behind computation. Instead of waiting for messages to arrive, you do non-blocking communication, and you work on things that actually scale while you wait for communication. And if you do global communication, you immediately have the problem that this does not scale well with the number of processors. It scales up to a point, maybe to 1,000 cores, but not to 100,000 cores. So these are the underlying things that you need to be aware of if you do any kind of large-scale parallel computing, but I keep that in mind for what I'm talking about next. I told you that I got into deal.II and I worked on my PhD thesis in 2011 was, I think, when I got done. And I helped link together p4est and deal.II and parallelize deal.II. Before that, before I started, we had limited parallel computing abilities. We had a duplicated mesh. All the data was shared. We had very simple parallel solvers. So we would call into PETSI, but we didn't even use algebraic multigrid, so we'd use simple Krylov methods, etc. So we could solve maybe 10 million unknowns and maybe on 100 cores. That was kind of where I started to work on deal.II. So in 2011, at that point, the largest run that we did was 16,000 cores, and in the order of 1 billion or 2 billion or 4 billion unknowns. And that was possible because we used p4est for the underlying mesh refinement. And note that this is also with adaptive refinement, right? If you just do global refinement, then that's easy enough, or if you have a static distribution of a mesh. But no, we did this all dynamically. And a lot of the work also went into distributing all the data structures inside deal.II. And we used algebraic multigrid for this. So we would hand the linear system to an existing library and say, please solve this as best as you can, and this is it. And just for the record, I want to tell you where we are now. So it's about 10 years later. Of course, machines got bigger and machines got faster. But there's also a large amount of work that went into this, and I will talk about this later or on Thursday, to get an order or two of magnitude bigger problems, larger number of cores. That's not possible by just keep doing the same thing, but we had to move away from assembling matrices and actually going matrix-free and doing geometric multigrid. But let me first talk about the state of 2011, because this is really educational to show you how we interact with p4est and how this works. So the idea when we set out was, and at the bottom here, you see the paper that we wrote in 2011. So this is me here. This is Karsten, who helped with this. This is my then postdoc advisor afterwards, Wolfgang Bengerth. And Martin Kronbichler is a colleague of mine. He is in Munich. He still works on large-scale finite element simulations. And the idea was that we build on p4est and that we abstract the parallel computing away, and then we described it in a more generic way in the paper, but the idea is it's available on deal.II and enables parallel computations for a broad community. So all kinds of users across the world who use deal.II can in a quite straightforward way compute on thousands of cores with millions or billions of unknowns. Of course, going to the largest scale that is out there today is harder, but at least I see one of the biggest contributions of what happened there is that I could enable other people to run large simulations. So let's get into it, right? So let's look at how this works. So how do you do parallelization? Well, you split up the mesh between processors. So for example, the picture on the top right is a mesh with 7 cells, and it has hanging nodes, it's adaptively refined, and maybe it is split between 2 processors. And if you have this, and spoiler alert, p4est can give us this, then you can assemble logically a global linear system, right? I don't assemble the linear system on each processor, but let's say, for example, I split the matrix and the solution vector and the right-hand side into blocks, and then I assign different processors to different blocks. So maybe the gray blocks are on processor 1, and the one on top on processor 0. But logically, it is a global linear system, right? And then I can use iterative linear solvers, Krylov methods, whatever, in parallel. And we chose this method. This is not the only way to do finite element simulations in parallel, but I think it is the best way to do it. The great thing is that it looks like a serial program to the user. Obviously, they have to deal with the fact that they don't have access to everything and that they assemble the right pieces. But logically, it works kind of like a sequential program. And good scalability is possible with a good preconditioner. I would just mention other people do, for example, domain decomposition methods. And there, you need to put a lot of knowledge into your specific PDE because you have to define boundary conditions between processors that depend on your PDE. So you have to put in a lot of effort. And even then, it might not scale in parallel because you need a cross solver or you need all kinds of other information for that. So this is what we did. And well, the mesh comes from p4est. The linear algebra will be done by p4est or Tridinos. So it's easy, right? So there's nothing else to do. Well, so this is kind of the structure here, the picture on the right of what you need to do data structure-wise and algorithm-wise to make everything work, right? And so in the deal.II language, we have the mesh, which is called a triangulation. We have a DOF handler that deals with the degrees of freedom. So this knows what are my shape functions, what are the numberings of these unknowns, where are they located, who is the owner, etc. And the important thing is that I have a global numbering, right? And computing this is hard. Notice that there's stuff related to the finite element spaces, to quadrature rules, to do integrals, to do mappings for curved geometry. All of this does not care about parallel computing. But of course, the mesh needs to be split up in parallel. Of course, the DOF handler needs to learn about how to number unknowns. The linear algebra needs to know how to do things in parallel. It's easy if you use an existing library, and it's hard if you do it yourself, which we do now for many problems. And the last part is post-processing. You've seen a little bit also in the last few days. You've probably seen MPI, IO, parallel output. But this is also maybe easy, depends. I think on the medium scale back then, 10 years ago, it was easy because you would just work on your local mesh and finish and communicate. Of course, for larger scale problems, you need to be a lot more sophisticated with what do you do for IO, what do you need to do for mesh refinement itself, etc., etc. Error estimators, all these kinds of things. This is kind of where I was and what I had to implement, right? And I would implement a mesh that is distributed based on p4est, and then I would build on these other things together with my colleagues. So we use p4est. I don't need to tell you what p4est is, but I left the slide in because the picture is a good illustration. And from our point of view, what we use p4est for is basically use it to manage refinement flags. So you can just think of each course cell as a bunch of refinement flags, how I get to the mesh that I actually want to use. So p4est knows the topology, it knows the partitioning, but I don't really care what p4est else does, right? I'm not using it to actually do many other things. By default, we are not telling p4est where our vertices are located, for example. We can for debug purposes, but we don't need it actually, because we use p4est actually just as a library to tell us how to partition. So what we do is basically 3 steps, and it's kind of interesting to do it that way. We create a course mesh in deal.II. So the coarsest mesh might consist of more than one cell. Think of a sphere that is made of, for example, 7 cells, right? Or so a cube sphere, or any other kind of complicated mesh that you want to do. Then when we have this coarse mesh, we internally copy this to p4est. So we create a parallel forest, and we copy the coarse mesh and the topology, the periodicity of the faces, etc., etc. The user doesn't see p4est, right? The user creates a mesh, for example, a shell or a sphere, and then it gets copied into p4est transparently. When you do mesh refinement, for example, you have this existing mesh, and you say, hey, I want to refine the cell in the top, then the user marks them inside deal.II, and then we send the refinement information to p4est, and then p4est does a balance operation, a repartition operation, runs the space filling curve to know which pieces belong to which, and then p4est has a representation like the picture on the right here, right? And now our representation of our triangulation or our mesh on the left here is out of date, right? Because the mesh got refined somehow, and also I might not even own the red cell anymore. I might not even need to know about it. So what we are going to do is we're going to query p4est for what are the local quadrants that actually are part of my mesh that I need. And what I'm going to do is, and I'm sorry I scrolled, what I'm going to do is I'm going to repeatedly query p4est, and I'm going to coarsen and refine my mesh to actually represent exactly the cells that I need based from the coarse mesh that we started with. And then, so this picture here illustrates the view from 2 different processors, for example. So if p4est decides to cut the space filling curve here, that the 4 cells are on one processor, the other 3 on the next processor, then the mesh might look like this here. In this case, this actually refined the same way, but you get the idea, or you get it in a second when I show a more complicated example, right? So we recreate a rich deal.II triangulation only for the local cells. And we store a lot more information for the local cells. We store coordinates, we store connectivity, we actually store objects for faces and points, we store material IDs, we actually store the hierarchy of cells. If I want to do a multigrid method, I actually need to know the parents, and I construct them as objects. So that's a lot more rich, but I can do this because p4est tells me exactly what I need and what I don't need. And the way we described this in the paper back then is that you can see p4est as an oracle. I don't need to care how p4est does all this stuff, right? The only thing I need to care about is which are my cells, what is the ghost layer, and take care of that this is consistent in parallel, and please do it efficiently. And that's what p4est does, right? We obviously use p4est for serialization, for data transfer, but when you do mesh refinement, we use it for other queries, but this is kind of the basic idea. And instead of trying to explain everything like this, let me just show you how this would look like. So at the top, you see logically how a mesh looks like, and then there's 3 views from the different processors. So red, so the left view is the view of processor 0. These are my cells. Then there's one ghost layer and that I know about. I constructed using p4est. And then there's some white cells that we call artificial cells that we're actually not using. But then you see that this is combined, the mesh. And you can also see that you can see the Z curve, right? You can see the hierarchical ordering here. It's not ideal. It's just an example how you can see how the adaptive refinement using p4est would work. And that's that. So what I did basically was, or what we did was hook in p4est and let it give us the local part of the mesh that we need. That was part one. Of course, that works for more complicated things, right? So it works for an arbitrary geometry. You see an example here with curved boundaries. We can do periodicity. We can use higher order mappings so that these cells are actually curved when you do your finite element computation. And there's more advanced features. So to get optimal higher order convergence, you actually have to smoothly interpolate between a curved manifold on the outside to straight faces on the inside. Otherwise, you lose convergence rates in a finite element computation. And this is an example here from one of these. For now, there's the limitation with p4est that you have to duplicate the coarse mesh, right? So we store it inside p4est and we store it inside deal.II, which is probably a lot worse because the coarse mesh in deal.II takes a lot more memory. But it allowed us to scale to very large problems and problem sizes. We have a different mesh refinement strategy that does not use p4est, that cannot really deal with adaptive refinement, but that distributes everything. You could use that for problems, but I guess that's not the topic today. The next thing that you need to do is you need to distribute degrees of freedom. And what I need, if you think of a linear finite element, here's an example with 8 cells, you have to give every shape function, every support point, here are the red crosses for a linear element, you have to give it an index, right? You have to number them. So I created a global numbering here from 0 to 8. And you need to do this without being able to know the whole mesh, right? And that's one of the algorithms that I helped writing 10 years ago. So you have to decide on ownership. You don't need to communicate for this. So I did in this picture here, I wrote the number in one of the cells, right, by chance. And so that might be the owner of the degree of freedom. Let me explain. p4est gives us a distribution, for example, here of the mesh, right? Not of degrees of freedom. And degrees of freedom also need to be distributed. But I can just use if the cell is mine, then the degrees of freedom are also mine, except when they are on the interface to a different processor, I have to decide who gets it, right? And then you can shift them to make them globally unique with very little communication. And then you have a global numbering, and then everybody knows, like, my degrees of freedom are from 100 to 500, so I know where to put it in the linear system, and then I know how to solve it. That happens all under the hood for the user. Then you do linear algebra. So you create distributed matrices and vectors, you assemble the local parts of the matrix, and then you use solvers and preconditioners. For example, using an algebraic multigrid method where you hand it the matrix and it does its thing and it solves. Of course, things are a little bit more complicated than I just explained to you, but I think it's enough to understand the complications here. Notice that I didn't talk about error estimation. I didn't talk about how do you decide when and where to refine based on that information. I didn't talk about how you deal with hanging nodes, because if you have a finite element space and you have a hanging node down here, I hope you can see my mouse cursor in one of the cells, where there's no cell on the other side, so there's no corresponding information there. And also I/O and all kinds of other stuff needs to be handled, and somebody had to write it and work on it. And then this was our proud picture 10 years ago. I learned a lot more about making plots and good scalability plots. But this is a strong scaling result back then with 300 million unknowns. So this is a linear system with 300 million by 300 million. It's a sparse matrix. And we solved this, and it's a 2D Laplace problem. This is actually deal.II step 40, which I will show you probably on Thursday. And we could scale that back then to 16,000 cores. Today, that is not a lot anymore, but back then it was quite a lot. And I don't have to tell you what all these pieces are, but for example, copy to deal.II is the reconstruction from p4est to deal.II. And this is what back then here actually took a lot of the computational time. But it did scale fairly well. You notice the one line that doesn't scale really well strongly is the linear solver, which was not in our hand, but was done, I think, using PETSI back then, but I'm not sure. But anyway, so algebraic multigrid methods don't scale super well to small small number of unknowns per processor. And this is the reason, or this is the thing I've been working on for the last 10 years since then. How do I get around the fact that the linear solver is so slow and is so is the main problem here, because we basically fixed everything else. Everything else scales in parallel, right? Scales optimally. That means I can go as large as I want if that's the case. Okay. This is the high-level overview that I wanted to give you of what deal.II is and how it interfaces with p4est. I think this is a good place to actually stop for a second, and I will double-check whether there are any questions. So there's the question, if I use p4est L nodes to assign degrees of freedom. No, I do not. I'm not too familiar with the feature, but I showed you the most simple version, how to distribute unknowns. Then it is just on vertices. But in reality, degrees of freedom can be on faces, lines in the interior, on vertices, and can also be more complicated than that. And so the logic is more complicated than I think would fit into p4est. So we're doing the assignment by ourselves. So and deal.II already knows how to do this assignment in sequential code and is made to do that, and also deal correctly with the way we are going to handle hanging nodes and how these are assigned. And so the parallel part was just how do I communicate on the ghost cells, basically. And we use p4est for that. So I got the question, how do I get the deal.II data structure from the p4est data structure? I can go back to the picture to show you, maybe try to help how this works. So this is just a sketch, right? The thing that I get from p4est, and I can later on show you the code as well, the thing I get from p4est is just, this is the list of quadrants that are owned on my processor. And with the list of quadrants, I know how to get from my coarse mesh to the correct mesh by refining, right? So for example, I start just with my coarse mesh. Maybe it's the red cell, right? And then I ask p4est, is this within my area? p4est says maybe yes. And then I ask p4est, well, is this actually a quadrant in my domain? p4est says, no, you have to refine. The quadrants are finer. And then I know that I have to refine, so then I call into deal.II to do the adaptive refinement. I split the cell into 4 children, and that does the correct thing with positioning the vertices and the connectivity, etc. And then I ask p4est again, hey, I have these 4 cells. Do I own any of these? And if yes, I mark them as owned by me. And if not, I'm going to continue. I can actually try to show you the code, but it's a simple recursive algorithm where I query in p4est. I construct the quadrant IDs, and I just query p4est whether this is a local quadrant or not, right? That's relatively simple. And because of the Z shape, I can actually know whether my quadrant is before what I own or after what I own, just with a comparison, right? And then I can query into p4est to do that. I hope that answers that question.
So it's close to noon. Are you? Yeah. Are you in the? Are you? So I mean, I'm fine, but I guess maybe at noon we should maybe take questions, or at least let people know if we're going to continue longer, or.
Yeah. So I could do a demo for about 10 minutes for the first example. And then we can stop for today, maybe, and then we continue on Thursday, if that is in everybody's interest.
Yeah, sounds perfect.
There's one more question. I will just try to quickly answer it. The question is, why do I need to store information? Well, I need to, because p4est does not have all the information I need. And you're talking about GPUs, even with vectorization, for example, I need to order my cells. I need to put them into data structures that are amenable to GPUs or vectorization. And I cannot do this just by using p4est. Yes, so p4est can give me information about faces and what my neighbor is, but we actually construct these to do rich operations on them. maybe it is possible to do it without, but a very complicated finite element library, I cannot just, I mean, if I write something from scratch, I could use everything from p4est, but this is not what we did. And we also don't want to rely on p4est because some people might not have or use p4est, right? There's other people who don't use it. But so I'm sure there's some features in p4est that we could use. Also, maybe they didn't exist 10 years ago. So I'm not saying p4est is bad, it cannot do the things we need to do, but there is certainly the case that we need to package and structure our data the way we need. Yeah, so we handle arbitrary geometry to pass to deal.II. We basically have a function that constructs a p4est mesh from a deal.II mesh, and then we have all the mesh generators and stuff inside deal.II, how we generate meshes. And I'm going to show that in action in a minute. So let me just do that, I think. And if you have more questions, I'm happy to answer them maybe on Thursday before I get started. So I don't need to iterate over the whole mesh, right? I need to iterate over the part that I see from my course mesh, which is not a problem at all. And yes, it is efficient. Okay, so let me show you that. If you go to the p4est school website and somehow click on this, you will find a link here. And this is the link to a GitHub repository that I created, where I created right now 3 example tutorial programs. And I will show you maybe the first 2, and then you can do the exercises and you can play with this some more, but I will just run the first 2 and then we can see. And I will try to answer some questions now, and we can follow up later on for this. So I am, if you do it down here, there's a link to a virtual machine image with instructions on how to run it. If you're experienced, you can also use Docker or install manually, but I would advise you for your first steps, maybe not to do a manual installation because it's quite complicated to get all the dependencies to work out. You need more than just p4est and deal.II to make the examples work. So let me just open the virtual machine. So this is the one that I imported here, and I'm just going to double click and launch it. And it's going to boot up in a second, and I'm going to wait for this to boot. And yes, Carsten is saying that I'm recreating its internal mesh representation when there's a refinement coarsening partitioning. Yes. So I only, whenever the mesh changes, I send to p4est, these are the cells that need to be refined and coarsened. And then I query p4est after partitioning, I query it. So which is my region? What are my cells? And I recreate basically the local mesh for the relevant parts. And this scales well in parallel because I only have local data and I do not access global information, right? Okay. So when you boot up the virtual machine, this is kind of how it looks like. And what I'm going to do first, let me try to make the terminal a little bit bigger. I hope you can see that okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to clone this repository. And the tutorial steps are actually in the first tutorial. If you click on it, here is actually the steps that I do. So I'm going to git clone in my virtual machine this repository. And then I have this deal.II p4est tutorial folder with the README with the steps. And I'm going into step 2. This is called step 2 because I will actually go in here. This is the deal.II step 2. So this is the second tutorial program if you're curious. You can look it up. I simplified it a little bit, made a few changes. I skipped step 1 because you already know a little bit about finite elements and meshes. And what this code does is it just creates and adaptively refines a mesh. It distributes unknowns and then just shows you numberings and unknowns. So it doesn't even solve a finite element problem, but it's very good to get started. So that's what I'm going to do. Okay, so we use CMake, and if you set up things correctly, you can run CMake dot in your current project folder. So I ran the CMake dot in your current step 2, and it finds deal.II and configures it, and then I can type in make, and this will compile this tutorial program, the version that I have, and this is the code, right? I will show it to you in a second. But maybe I will just going to run it. And depending on your machine, it takes a little bit longer to compile and link. Virtual machines are not particularly fast at that. Let me just open it up, maybe inside the virtual machine, so that I can edit it. I use VS Code here as an example. So I've used code dot to open it up in Visual Studio Code. And I have to let it scan for kits. And then it will run the necessary things to compile. And somehow terminal window. Okay. Okay, so tutorial program 2 compiled. And we can look at the source code in a second. But if I do ls, there's just some binary and some stuff like this. And I actually need to be able to configure. So what you need to do, if you want to use VS Code, you have to go to CMake and configure, scan, and then it should detect all the libraries and all the headers and know how these things work. So I created a binary, right, and I can run this. And only thing it prints to the screen is done, which is not particularly interesting. But if I do ls, I see a bunch of files that got generated. One thing I can do is I can go in there with the file browser. So I click on the file browser. I go to p4est tutorial, step 2. And I can show you, for example, the grid SVG. So this is an SVG output of the mesh that we generate. And this example here, that's the original mesh that is used in the step 2 program. So this is a spherical shell in 2D that is refined adaptively closer to the inner circle. And then I output this information. And notice that I also have additional information here. For example, if I refine, my new vertices actually end up on the spherical geometry and not on the straight connection of these vertices, right? So there's not only the topology, but there's also the knowledge that this is, and we call this a manifold. There's a manifold description that says, by the way, the inner and outer thing is round. And actually, if you look at it closely, even the inside of the geometry is round, right? You can see that this vertex also landed, from the yellow cells, also landed not on the direct connection, a linear interpolation between the two, but actually ends up back on the curved geometry. And the reason is that we want this is to be more accurate, to represent solutions, for example, spherical solutions, more precisely. There's other stuff that we generate, and I will quickly show you maybe the first one. This is a sparsity pattern. So if I for this problem, distribute degrees of freedom and then decide for each coupling phi i, phi j, whether there's an entry in my matrix, right? For those of you who know finite elements, you know how finite element matrices look like. They only if phi I and phi j are close enough to each other that the support functions share support, then you actually have a non-zero entry. And so in this example, this is how the sparsity pattern looks like, for example, I think for a linear finite element, but I have to double check. So this is all that this tutorial does, and I will quickly show you how it works. And notice that it runs sequentially and that it does not use any parallel computing or p4est or anything like this. Okay. It looks like I did not manage to parse the header files correctly. I thought this is all I have to do, but let's see if I have to reconfigure. Maybe not. I think I have to specify that CMake determines what the compilers are. I cannot get it to work. Oh, well. I can show it to you in a second outside the virtual machine, maybe. So this is very simple, and it's not very C++ heavy at this point. I'm going to the bottom to the main function, and I deleted a lot of the comments because it's just too much information. If you go to the deal.II tutorial, step 2, you have a lot of documentation about how it works and what it does, but I extended it a little bit. So we generate a mesh, we generate this grid that I just showed you, and then we visualize it, and then we create a DOF handler that I mentioned earlier in the talk, and then we are going to distribute the unknowns. These are all functions up here, and we're also going to renumber them. I'm not going to talk about that. You can look at it if you want. And so then these functions here just do the things that I just mentioned. And let me just quickly read from top to bottom to show you what is happening. So the make grid function calls into deal.II and generates a hypershell. So the hypershell is the coarse mesh. Let me show you again. That corresponds to this, right? So that's the coarse mesh with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 cells, I think, in this example. With the radius that you specify, and the number of cells, I think that's the number of cells in the half shell, right? So if I wanted to, I can, for example, try to reduce this number and then go back to the terminal and compile and see whether that works. And while I do this, this is the logic to do mesh refinement. So what I do is I do 3 loops. I iterate over all active cells. I iterate over all vertices. And then I compute the distance from the center point, that's the center of my mesh. I'll show you again, that's the center of the mesh here. And I compute the distance to this particular vertex. So cell, arrow, vertex, V gives me a point, and I can compute the distance between these 2 points. And if the distance is more or less the inner radius, then I mark the cell for refinement. And I do this for all cells. And when I'm done with this, I say, please execute coarsening and refinement. And I do this 3 times, right? And this is how we end up with this mesh. So even if you're not very familiar with deal.II or C++, I think this is quite readable in what it does and how it works. You see some C++ features here. For example, the triangulation is templated on the dimension. The points are templated on the dimension. And the hypershell is actually a function that's called a hypershell and not a shell, because if you run it with a 2D triangulation, it gives you a 2-dimensional mesh. If you run it with a 3D triangulation, it gives you a 3-dimensional mesh. Right? So this is how that works. So this is actually dimension independent. The only thing I have to do is I have to change this 2 to a 3 and this 2 to a 3. I guess the number of vertices per cell also changes, but everything else is automatic. This is, by the way, another reason that I have to construct everything also in the deal.II language, because this is not a C code, this is a C++ code. So you have a concept of a point that has methods attached to it, right? And so I have to create all these information. So this is the make grid function. And visualization, I will show you some more complicated things in a second, but the easy way is to just say write SVG and you're done. The higher order output I can show you, but sadly it doesn't work with the old version of ParaView. But you can play with this if you want. You can at least look at the files, grid and curved grid. But I can show you outside the VM how it actually looks like. Let me just show you that. I have the example ready here, and I'm going to change this to true, and I'm going to compile again, and I'm going to then run the step 2. And this is a newer version of ParaView, and ParaView by now also supports higher order geometry. And what we do inside deal.II, and I think I did something wrong here. Actually, thought I would get the higher order grid. Oh, it's called curved grid. I'm sorry, I opened the wrong file. So if I open curved grid, you actually see what deal.II knows, right? So not only do we know that these are curved elements, we actually compute on these curved elements, right? If you don't, then these cells would look like they're overlapping here, right? Or that they're not correct. But inside deal.II, when we do higher order computations, this is actually the cell we compute on that is curved. So quadrature does not evaluate on the straight edges, but actually the quadrature points are in the correct locations of the curved geometry. And we do this here with a manifold description. So there's a parametric description of how do you map from the reference cell to the real cell. And that one just uses the information here that we have, that we know we are on a circular domain. So this is really cool, right? To generate very accurate solutions and so on, etc. Sadly, when I run it inside the VM, it will look a little bit weird. There's not much else that is going on in this tutorial program, so I encourage you to look at it. But let me just show you how we generate the sparsity pattern. So we distribute the unknowns, and then we create a sparsity pattern basically with a make sparsity pattern function. And then I can visualize this with an SVG file, and I showed you that a minute ago. So that's the very basic version, and this is the first tutorial program. And if you are curious, I have in here a couple of example questions that you can try to answer, and more links and more documentation. So for example, there's the deal.II documentation of this, and you see that this is the tutorial, and this is what it teaches, and this is the amount of text. And then every single line of code is documented, and you can see how things work. Not going to show you all the text, but this is as much information as you can give for like a 20-line piece of code that does this computation. This is kind of the high-level overview of how you do this. And the next thing, and I'm not going to do this today, is how do you do this in parallel? And I'm going to start with how do you do this in parallel and how you do adaptive refinement in parallel next. So how do you hook in p4est? How do you hook in MPI? And this is going to be the second example that I have. This is example step-amr. This is a new program that I wrote that is relatively short, and it just extends the current program to whatever is needed to run with p4est. And I will cover this on Thursday, and I will go over the code and show you how it works. If you're curious, you can already take a look at it. It is it's quite simple, and it has some exercises related to it. And by the way, this code for the adaptive refinement is actually going to be identical, because from the user's perspective, you don't need to take care of what the p4est is doing and how all of these methods interact. So keep that in mind when you look at this very simple first step with deal.II, and then how this works with when you actually run it with p4est. And I think my time is more or less up. So I will stop at this point with sharing my screen and with my presentation. It has been 60 minutes, and I think you're all tired. But I encourage you to contact me and let me know what you would like to know. If you Google my first name and my last name, you should find my email address, or it's also on the GitHub page when you go on the GitHub repo. That is linked from the school website. And if you have specific things you want me to talk about on Thursday, I'm happy to do so. But my plan right now is to continue and basically show you how you use p4est, how you run in parallel, how you visualize solutions, and how you compute and actually solve a finite element problem. And then I also want to talk about the large-scale runs that I have done together with my postdoc. That will be kind of the first session, and then the third session that I have on Thursday, the last one. I'm flexible in what to do. I can answer questions, or I can show some things, or I can show some simulations.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. I was going to say thanks for the talk.
Yeah, thanks.
Are there any questions? Let's see, there's one question here. It would be great, or maybe, I don't know, Arash, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. You wanted to go to the code, but perhaps there was not enough time, and this was the first presentation on deal.II, so maybe it was not the time. But it would be great at some point if you could please elaborate on how you integrated p4est into deal.II. That would be very helpful for people who already have a software and are thinking about integrating p4est into their own software.
Yes, let me give you a very short answer right now, and we can talk about it longer in more detail, and I can show you code some other time. But I'm sorry, I disabled my webcam. I wanted to. Am I still allowed to share my screen, Carsten, for a minute, or? Yes, let me put it back on. Sorry. Okay, no problem. I'll share my screen. And I mentioned this on the slides. I hope you can see this now. So when you, it's actually also in the repository. So if I show you if the repository that I created, and if you go to the main README, there's additional resources. And the original paper that I wrote with Karsten and my two colleagues that describes how we interact with p4est is linked there. And this is actually not a bad way to get the high-level overview of how we use p4est, right? So this is the idea with the oracle and how to call into it. If you want to take a look at that, that would be one option. The other thing is I can show the code and how we actually query p4est, right? Maybe I'll do this on Thursday because we are running kind of late and later than we're supposed to be running. And if you're more curious, I can point you at the code and I can quickly go over it. I would have to look it up exactly how we did it. It was 10 years ago. But anyway, so if you want to already take a look, you can do that way. All right, good morning, everybody. Hope everybody's doing all right. Yeah, so today I have 2 sessions. This is the continuation of the first session that we did on Tuesday. And my goal for today is to show you some more example code that actually uses p4est. We see how the output looks like, and I will run it in a minute. And the second thing is that I also have additional material, and I'm curious what you guys are interested in, what you guys want to see. And I assume there's going to be plenty of time in the second session, which is after an hour break after my first session, for you to ask questions, and I can just show code, whatever you're interested in. I don't want to just lecture at you for the whole time. That said, I have prepared some stuff for this morning for me, and I will start to do that now, unless there's important things to get started. But I think I will just jump in, and then if you have questions, we can talk about things. So let me share my screen, and we can get going. Okay, I hope everybody can see my screen at this point. It looks like that it is indeed visible. Okay, so this is the presentation. It's a little bit updated from last time, but I'm just showing you the title slide in case you didn't see the first talk that I did 2 days ago. So this is, again, an introduction on how the deal.II finite element library and p4est can interact to give you massively parallel finite element simulations. And I'm not going to show you the old slides again, but this is where we left off, right? So I showed to you basically how we can distribute a mesh and run and basically interact with p4est to do things, but I haven't shown you the code. So the demonstration 1 was that I showed you step 2, and then I answered questions, and then I basically stopped where I left off. Before I show you the second tutorial program that I uploaded to the website, this is in the folder step-amr, fitting name, which the topic is, it's a very simple example building on the first example where we're just modifying a mesh in sequential code, and how you interact with p4est and actually show you that there's p4est under the hood. And this is a simplified program that I just wrote a few days ago for this tutorial. Before I show you the code, that's the next thing that I will do, I want to quickly talk about finite element solutions and solution vectors. And for that, I have a picture here. So imagine that this is your computational mesh, which consists of maybe 2 coarse cells, and the right coarse cell is refined ones. So you end up with 5 what we call active cells, like, or in the p4est language, quadrants. And let's just assume for a second that this is split up between yellow, blue, green, and red processors. And again, like we discussed on Tuesday, this comes from p4est, right? The ownership information. And in a way, I can treat it as an oracle. I know p4est won't do this kind of distribution, but let's assume that this is part of a bigger mesh, and this is what p4est gives me. And The circles that I've drawn in here is of a Q2 element. So this is a polynomial, tensor product polynomial finite element space of degree 2. So it's basically x squared plus, so a times x squared plus b times y squared plus all the mixed terms up to down to the constant. So quadratic in each of the two coordinate directions. And it turns out that you have, when you're sitting on a cell like this, that you have 3 by 3 or 9 functions, polynomial functions in each cell, right? And these circles denote the support points of these. When you construct finite element spaces, you often do a nodal basis where the finite element support functions are 1 inside a support point and they're 0 in the other support points. And you can think of it this way. If you imagine the red cell here, I have 9 different shape functions that are quadratic functions, and they are, for example, 1 in the bottom left red, and then 0 in all the other nodes, and then et cetera, et cetera. And these support points are actually on the interface on vertices or on faces, or in 3D also on lines, because when you want a continuous finite element variable, you have to make sure that the values line up and the shape functions line up. So for example, if I have an unknown here, then the basis function is actually not only inside the red cell, but it is also in the blue cell with the same coefficient in front of it, right? So make hat-like functions like this. And so the ownership is here done by color, right, of the cells coming from p4est. And last time I also talked about, from that I can infer some ownership of the degrees of freedom for the processor. So notice that the circles are also colored, and I decided in this situation that the processor red does not own the green 3 unknowns at the top, even though these are local shape functions, right? So red obviously needs to know about those, but the question is, what is red interested in? And the obvious thing is, red is not interested on an unknown on the very left over here from the yellow cell, right? We might not even know what's going on over there. We might not even know the yellow cell and how refined it is and what quadrants are in there, etc. But it's kind of obvious, I already said it, we need to know about these unknowns, the green unknowns in the red cell. And for this, we construct ghosted vectors. So our linear algebra vectors do not only have our own, but can have additional entries. And instead of doing formulas and whatever, to give you just a high-level understanding, is we consider, from the perspective of the red processor, 3 different sets of unknowns. Owned unknowns is the small area here, right? These are the red circles. Then there's the active cells. That is all the unknowns that belongs to cells that are my cells. And I need this information, for example, if I want to do a matrix vector product, if I need to know solution values, for integration, for computing a stiffness matrix, I need to write into these, et cetera, et cetera. But nevertheless, they are owned by the other processor. And then there's an even bigger set, which we call the relevant set, which also contains unknowns that are in the ghost layer and all the unknowns in that ghost layer. And we might need to know that as well. I go to that in a second. So with these 3 sets, there's the owned unknowns where we store vector and matrix entries, right? And where we own them and where only one processor is the owner. Then there's the set of active unknowns, and we need these for assembling, computing integrals, graphical output, because processor red will output the red cell, so it needs to know the coefficients for that. But it doesn't need to store matrix rows for it, right? And then there's the relevant set, and you can imagine if I need to compute DG fluxes between the blue and the red cell, then I need to know also the coefficients in the blue cell. And for example, an error estimator does the same thing. It typically computes this. So we often interact with 2 different sets. So if I do a linear solve, I only care about owned, right? I store the owned, and that's what I compute. But if I do some kind of post-processing, I typically create a relevant vector with the relevant DOFs in there that I can read from, but that I basically just get from the owning processor. And these are all subsets of all the unknowns, right? If we number all of them from 0 to total number of unknowns, then we call this class an index set, and that represents the subset of indices that we care about. And these are then stored in vectors. And this is a concept that we need to know because we have to construct vectors with own and relevant entries. And this is what I'm going to show you in a second, right? So that's something we need to do, and that's what we are doing in deal.II. And we can build all of this without any involvement of p4est at this point because I already know about degrees of freedom. So I'm just going to show you the example, and here I have some notes for things that I have to mention. I will get back to this in a second to make sure that I cover all the things that I want to cover. I have not seen any comments or question at this point, so I assume that everybody's with me so far. So this is, again, the virtual machine, and I already opened it up in this folder, which is step-amr. I already set up the project so that I can show you this. I already compiled, so the code is already compiled. And what I can do now is I can run this, and I can run this in parallel. So, for example, let me run this with 2 processors, and I'm going to run this tutorial program. And it will output a little bit more information this time. And the funny part is that I wanted to show you the example in 2D. So I kind of solved the problem already. So let me quickly fix that. The funny part is one of the exercises is, what do you have to do to make it run in 3D? And I accidentally pushed the diff for running it in 3D. Oh, well, OK. I will update this in a second. So let me recompile and actually show you how this looks like in 2D. And I will show you the code in a second, and you can take a look. So what this example does in the notes, you might see, is I'm running in parallel. I'm representing the mesh using p4est, and I'm not solving a finite element problem, but what I do is I just interpolate a known function into the finite element space, and then I'm going to output the solution so we can look at it, and I'm using an error estimator to do adaptive refinement on that finite element function. And this is easy enough. I don't have to create any matrices. I just have to create vectors. So it now says that it compiled correctly. So let me run again. So I did an MPI run, and in 2D it runs much faster. And you see that I'm doing 7 refinement cycles, and I'm outputting the number of unknowns and the number of active cells and some other information. So if I do an ls, you will see now that I am outputting VTU files. This is 1 VTU file per processor per refinement. So the first one is the refinement cycle. The second one is the processor. And then there's a pVTU file, which is an index that says, hey, these 2 pieces belong together and form solution 1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open ParaView. And I'm going to open in the step-amr folder, I'm going to open the pVTU files. I'm going to hit apply. And you will see that what we get here is a gray L-shaped domain. So let me turn on the mesh. So this is the mesh at the beginning. And I can also color by the solution. So this is looks more or less radially symmetric solution, right? It goes from 0 to 1, and it's in the 1 in the re-entrant corner here. And that's the simple thing. And then instead of time, what we have is we have the adaptive refinement cycle. So if I can go forward in time, we see that we refine close to the area in the middle. And let me just add a filter alphabetically warp by scalar. And I'm going to warp by U. And when I hope you know all how to use ParaView. And when I do this now, you can see that this is how the solution looks like. All right, so that's fairly simple, and I will show you the code for this in a second. The thing that I also output, just so you know, is that I also output the subdomain, so you can see how the domain is distributed between the different processors, and this is changing with adaptive refinement. Okay. So this is all that the program does. It's not super interesting, but obviously there's stuff going on here in the background. OK, so that's what the program does. And let me just quickly run through the code and show you what it does. I am sharing my screen, yes. Do other people have problems seeing my shared screen? Would be great if I could get a quick comment in the chat. Okay, so it seems like most people can see. So if you don't see it, you might need to exit and enter the chat. Okay, I hope it doesn't have too much lag when I'm sharing my screen. So this is the source code that I'm going to go through. And there's a bunch of headers because we now need to have PETSI and or Tridinos for linear algebra. And we also have other functions for grabbing the p4est, which I'll show you in a second. I'm not going to talk about the header files. So this example here uses a little bit more C++. So instead of the first tutorial, I have everything inside a class called example problem. And I have a couple of functions. I mean, we just call run, and run in turn called setup, refine grid, and output results. So we'll call these routines in a loop, basically. And the important change from last time is we don't have a triangulation, but we have a parallel distributed triangulation. That's the kind of deal.II triangulation that uses p4est under the hood. And then I have a finite element space that I didn't have before. Oh, yes, I did have that before. I have a DOF handler that stores the unknowns. This is unchanged. This is unchanged. And now I have two index sets for my locally owned unknowns and for the locally relevant unknowns. This is the picture that I showed you a minute ago, right? And these are the index sets. And then I'm storing solution vectors. One of them is with locally owned, and one is with locally relevant. They're called distributed and locally relevant in this. We're going to use this for the computation, for the solving, which we're not really solving. And then we are using this one to visualize. That's basically the variables that we have. Let me double check. Okay, so things seem to be working. So the main loop is basically initialize MPI and then run the example problem in 2D. And if I go to the run function is this here. There's some printing, hey, I'm running on X MPI runs in this dimension. And then I have a loop, 0 to 7 cycles. In cycle 0, I create a mesh and I refine it globally. And then in all later steps, instead of creating the mesh, I'm going to refine the mesh. And on each refined mesh, I'm going to set up the finite element space. I print some more stuff. And then I'm interpolating a function that I show you in a second onto this vector. And then I'm going to do this assignment here from the distributed vector to the locally relevant vector. And what this does is it copies the ghost values and makes them available in this vector. And then I can run output results that shows the graphical result of this. And let me just quickly show you the code of the specific functions here. But let me start by the solution. So solution is a little class that just has this expression, which given a point returns a value. And the value is the distance from the origin in an exponential. And then there's a little bit cosine term in there to make it a little bit more interesting so that you can see a cosine wave here on the outside. Not super important, but so that's the solution, and you can play with that and change it obviously to do something else. That's the solution function, and then very quickly, the setup system is quite simple. I distribute my unknowns. I'm extracting the locally owned DOFs and the locally relevant DOFs, and then I'm creating the vectors, and I'm also creating constraints for the hanging nodes, but I don't really want to talk about it at this moment. You can look it up if you're more curious. But basically, that's when you look at this picture here. I have unknowns. Let me go in here. I have unknowns that are half yellow, half blue, and basically, this is a blue unknown, but it has to be constrained to a value that depends on the yellow cell because I don't want a gap inside my solution here. And this is done using constraints. The grid refinement is not super interesting. Like I said, it uses an estimator. It's called a Kelly estimator. It uses a gradient jump estimator of the solution to look at the solution between two cells and says, how big is the gradient jump between the two solutions that I have? And if it's big, I need to refine, and that automatically refines inside the singularity that I built in there. And so the error estimator, what it does is it only estimates for each of my own cells what the error is in this cell based on the solution vector. And what I get is a error per cell vector for the number of cells that I locally own. And then somebody has to decide based on this who refines what. And that happens in this function here, refine and coarsen fixed number, where I say I want 10% of my cells refined, 0% coarsened, and use this vector to figure this out. And this is quite complicated if you think about it, because I have to find the cells with the largest error globally without making any of this information known globally. So it's an iterative process to estimate which of the cells are the biggest error and who refines what. And it's quite efficient in parallel. It does very little global communication to do that. If you want to see how this works, I can, in the later session today, talk about it if you're curious. And then I run execute coarsening and refinement. If you remember from the first tutorial from 2 days ago, I did basically the same thing, except that I marked cells for refinement manually. But if you assume that this function does the same thing, it marks cells, then you have already seen this. And then this execute coarsening and refinement internally does send flags to p4est, and then it does refine, balance, repartition, and then it copies back to deal.II. This is all done inside this one function call. And I think this is pretty much all what this tutorial does. Oh no, output results. Yes, this is the thing that I wanted to show you. Quickly check, no questions at this point. Okay, so output results. I'm outputting the solution vector U with the locally relevant solution vector. I need to do this because I need to know all values on my own cells that I'm going to write out. And what I also do here is that I generate the subdomain. So I basically have a vector for all my local cells where I just write in, hey, this is my number, so I can visualize to you over here the subdomain color, right? And the output here is actually in parallel. So what this one does is it writes the pVTU record and the VTU files, but under the hood, you can say within groups how many files you want to write out. And if the number of files is less than the number of MPI ranks, we use MPIO to efficiently output this information. And so typically what people do is, what I do is that I just use one output file, or maybe as many as I need for visualization if the solution gets really large. Then it will generate one VTU file per refinement cycle, and I can visualize it just in the same way. But in this example, it generates 8. So if you run with 7 processors, it creates 7 files. If you run with 8, it will create 8. If you run with 9, it will also create 8, et cetera, et cetera. So this is kind of the limit of number of files to be done. It's not an ideal thing, but I just wanted to have it in there so you can play with it. So for example, if you change this to 1 and rerun the code, then it will just create 1 file per. And then I wanted to show you that we're actually using p4est. And what I do here is I ask the triangulation, please get me the p4est. And what this function returns is a pointer of type deal.II internal p4est types templated on dimension and then forest. So this is not a p4est type, but it is a deal.II type. And if you go into this, I hope I have this set up here that I can go to the declaration. Yes, so you can see here that this class is actually just type def, right? So it's a C++ type def, more modern ways to do using. So a types dimension 3 forest is a p8est t, and a types 2 forest is a p4est t. So we have these wrappers around all the p4est types, And as a consequence, I can write this in a dimension-independent way, right? If you run this code in 2D, it gives you a p4est. If you run it in 3D, it gives you a p8est. And then I can also run functions. For example, the easiest function to run with p4est is the checksum function, right? Which is p4est checksum in 2D and p8est checksum in 3D. So we have wrappers that are very simple, right? They are just around the p4est functionality. But this way, you can write dimension-independent code. And so I generate the checksum. I don't know if you saw it in the output. The output said, hey, this is the p4est checksum that you compute. But this works in 2D and in 3D without any changes in the code and any changes on your side. The whole example works in 2D and in 3D. And one of the first exercises for you is to run it in 3D. I guess I screwed that up. You can run it in 2D and see that it's the same code. And the only change that you have to do is, when I look at the bottom, I have to run it in 3D. So I changed the 1, 2 here at the bottom to a 3. And C++ templates make it possible to run the same program in 2D and in 3D efficiently, because the compiler does all the copy and paste and correct work. If you want to, you can actually also get access to the p4est type based on dimension with specialization. So if you want to, you actually have access to the individual types. So I show you this because A, I want to show you that we're actually using p4est, and B, I want to show you this because if you write a C++ code, you typically try to be a little bit higher level and abstract things. And we found it necessary to write our code that interacts with p4est in a dimension-independent way. So this way, we can run p4est in 2D and in 3D without any if-defs or without any kind of special code that depends on the dimension, because we transparently handle all of this. And this was really useful for us. I mean, typically, the user doesn't use any of this, right? This is the escape hatch that I show you. But there's really no use for the user to actually reach into p4est to do this manually. So I got the question whether I need to generate multiple executables for different dimensions. So in this example, yes. So in this example, this is just the 2D example, right? But if I change this to a 3 and recompile, then I have a 3D code. But this is not necessary. So what I can do is, for example, say if argv1 is equal to something, then I run it in 3D, and else I'm going to run it in 2D. This is how it is typically done in our codes that are more serious. So, for example, the aspect code. Of course, I cannot do a C-star comparison like this. But in the aspect code, we have some logic like this. So I probably want to do, I don't know, it's something like this, right? Then, oh, it's not 2, it's 3. OK, so this would be a way to run both the 2D and 3D, and you compile them separately. You might argue, hey, this is not great, but this is super important for us, because most of the finite element logic is way different in 2D and 3D, and deciding at runtime is way too slow. So you decide at runtime, but you basically compile the code twice, either in separate binaries or on the same binary, and then the code is efficient. So for example, if you remember when we did refinement, oh, well, that's in the other example. But so, for example, we have a Gauss quadrature here that depends on the dimension for integrating the gradient jumps on the interface. The Gauss quadrature knows how big it is if I know the dimension. But if I don't know the dimension, it is a dynamically sized thing that is a lot slower. So I guess I can show it to you also at the function that we define here. Let me try to find it. So the function here that we define gets a point dim. This is templated on the dimension. And we do this for efficiency, because the point does not store the dimension internally. But if dimension is 2, that gets compiled to a point with x and y. And if the dimension is 3, this gets compiled to a point with 3 dimensions. So if I compute the norm, there's no for loop depending on the dimension, because everything gets compiled out. And this is immensely useful for performance. And this is why p4est, for example, uses a 2D and a 3D separate unit to compile to be able to do the same optimizations, right? Because you cannot at runtime, every time you access an object, say, what's my dimension, and then react on this. So C++ templates are a crucial piece in achieving the goal of efficiency, and that we use inside deal.II. So this example here is purely MPI. We have support for hybrid parallel. I will talk about this in a minute. And yes, we also have GPU support, but the GPU support is a little bit more limited and more special case. I'm not a big believer of GPU code for high order FEM, and it's kind of difficult to do, but we're getting there. Okay, so this is kind of all that I wanted to show for this example. Let's see. Let me go to my notes to see if I talked about everything that I wanted to talk. So I showed you ghosted vectors. I showed you that there's an internal p4est wrapper that we have. It's not just a bunch of lines of code, but that wraps all functions and all types of p4est in an independent way. Things that I could talk about is the refinement loop and how we copy information, but maybe I'll leave this for the second part. And then we also use p4est for checkpointing and for solution transfer. So we use the p4est transfer and the p4est load and save to store solution vectors, meshes, refinement, and all that information. And the refinement loop, I got asked by one of you after my lecture on Tuesday, but maybe I'll show this in the later conversation today, and instead now go through my slides. I think that's more well-rounded to actually do this. Yeah, we use the ghost exchange functionality. So the construction of the ghost layer and the exchange of information. Yes, we don't do it for the linear algebra because at the moment we have the linear algebra objects, they know how to do their communication. So we don't use p4est for everything because we also run parallel computations without p4est. So we only use it for the stuff that relates to the setup and the mesh itself. And that's on purpose. That's not because the routines are bad inside p4est, but we have to have them anyway, and we have them written in C++, and it matches much better to what we are doing, and so allows us to run computations without p4est if we need to. We don't do that very often because most of our runs use p4est, but we can if we need to. And linear algebra packages. So I didn't show you that. I guess I should. So you can ask, what are these vector types? So the vector here is called an MPI vector. So this is a deal.II class, but it's actually in this situation just a wrapper around p4est vector. So C++ version of it that allows me to access things in a nice abstracted way. And I can just change the type def to give me a trillionos version of this, and the same code runs. So there's one if def here at the top where I basically use the namespace. So if I switch this, then you will run with trillionos instead of p4est as the linear algebra. And they know how to do ghost exchange during a linear solve, for example. Yeah, if you're curious, there's a file called p4est wrappers.h that contains this stuff. If I open it up, so this embeds the p4est types, and then has the types that I already showed you, and then also has the functions, right? So for example, quadrant compare is a function that works in 2D and in 3D, and it calls the correct quadrant compare function. These are just simple. Yes, so I use p4est iterate. Yes, so we do iterate when we do the construction of the deal.II mesh. I'm not sure if we use p4est search. I would have to look that up. Sean, if you want, save that question, and then we can look it up together in the source code in the second session if you are around later. Okay, so that's this. And the thing that comes next is actually solve a Laplace problem in parallel. So what else is missing? We kind of have most of the mesh refinement and parallel computing pieces in there. So the thing that is missing from this original, let me show you from last time. This was the picture here from using an algebraic multigrid method. So this is the step 40, right? And let me just go back to this. So the step 40 is the next example that I would like to show. And I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I would just want to go through and show you how it looks like. So let me, do I have this open somewhere? I don't have the project open. So let me just show it to you. And oh, by the way, here are the exercises. So the exercises are for you to do if you want to do exercises. So let me show you step 40. And you will see that it's very similar. When I said I wrote the step-amr for you guys, then yes, that's true. But I also, well, this is not great to read. But it looks very similar. And the main difference is that we now have a solve function where we actually assemble a linear system and then we solve a linear system. Let me make this a little bit bigger, hopefully. I can do it. Okay. Fascinating. Okay, so the difference is that we create, now it's a little bit too big. We not only create vectors, but we create a sparsity pattern, and then we create a system matrix, but only for the local entries on that processor. And the magic here is all inside deal.II, basically. So I'm creating it using my locally owned DOFs for rows and columns. And the sparsity pattern is the entries of where there are entries in the matrix. We looked at it on Tuesday. And this is all done internally inside deal.II because there's nothing that the user has to do at this moment. And it's not super interesting because this is, in a way, interfacing with p4est or Tridinos, and that's not the topic of today. I want to quickly show you the assembly. So this is a Laplace problem. So we assemble grad U, grad V, right? And this is explicitly done here by iterating over all cells, active cells. And for each cell that I actually own, and it's not a ghost cell, what I'm going to do is I'm going to assemble into the matrix at entry ij. I'm going to assemble grad I at quadrature point q times grad j, phi j at quadrature point q, and then times j cross w, and that's the integration weight. So what we're computing here is the integral grad phi I, grad phi j using quadrature. This is the quadrature weight and the cell weight from the reference cell. And that gives me the matrix. So the loops are over each cell, over each quadrature point, over each shape function I, over each shape function j, assemble grad phi I, grad phi j, j cross w. And I also assemble the right-hand side. And then what I do is this creates a local matrix, and then I'm copying it into the global matrix. If you've seen a finite element program, this is how you would write a finite element program. You assemble local matrices per cell, and then you write it into the global one. And what we have to do, obviously, is we have to communicate, because I'm also writing into entries that do not belong to me. So if you look back to this picture here, when I'm the red cell, I'm also going to write into rows that are green that actually don't belong to me. And this happens transparently when I run compress and it sends the data off. This is done, for example, using p4est ghost exchange or Tridinos ghost exchange. So it's relatively light for the user to do. And if you compare this to the first deal.II tutorial that assembles a matrix, the only difference here is locally owned. And this is the red processor then only cover red cells, right? Everything else is the same. So it's not hard at all for the user. And the reasoning is it looks logically like a sequential code. And that's our goal, right? Because the user can write this without being an expert in p4est. And under the hood, it efficiently does exactly what you want it to do and scale in parallel to large problem sizes. And the solver is also not super interesting. We have a wrapper. So this one uses CG and uses the AMG preconditioner that is p4est's hyper or Tridinos ML. And I basically say initialize preconditioner, and then I say solve, and it solves the linear system for me in parallel. And this is the assignment that we had a minute ago, where I solve with a vector without ghost values, and afterwards I do the ghost exchange into a vector with ghost entries. And this allows me to then visualize the solution. But this is the only difference, these two functions, compared to the other tutorial that I just showed to you. And then let me just go to the step 40 in deal.II. So this is the deal.II tutorial step 40, which I based it on. And I just want to show it to you so you can see how it is documented. And so it explains what we did and when we did it. And this is part of the paper that we wrote 10 years ago. And it explains how this works and what the finite element problem is and how we're doing these things with a lot of links and information. And then we go line by line, basically, what all these classes do, what these functions do, et cetera, et cetera. It's kind of what I just did a minute ago, but a little bit more detail. And then let me just show you the results. So this is when you run it. I'm not going to run it right now, but this is how the solution looks like. And the right-hand side here creates a very strong gradient in the middle of the domain with a sine shape. And then this is the refinement. And the colors are the p4est ownership, local ownership of this, right? So this is the example. It's relatively simple from the finite element perspective, but under the hood, there's a lot of stuff going on from p4est and how that works. Okay, then with that, this is kind of what I wanted to show for the demos. So I showed you how to solve in parallel, and this is neat, and it works with 10,000 processors, and it works with 1 billion or 2 billion unknowns, but then you run into trouble. And you can already see this in this picture here, right? You can see that the linear solver doesn't scale, and it's 300 million unknowns, and back then that was about the size that we were comfortable solving with. And we pushed this to like 2 billion or 3 billion unknowns, then you run into issues with size of integers if you count the number of unknowns. So there were some changes in deal.II that were necessary. But nevertheless, the linear solver doesn't scale particularly well. And since then, so since 2011, I have been working on improving this. And let me try to go back to the slide I showed last time. Is today we can run on the biggest machines with 100 times bigger problems and 10 to 100 times number of cores. And that was a big investment in development time. And that's basically what I've been working on for the last 10 years. And I would like to show you and hint a little bit what is necessary to go there. I mean, p4est was already at a point to run at 100,000 cores with their algorithms back then, but we were not. And what we were doing and what I just showed you how to do is not sufficient to actually solve interesting problems at that scale. With 100 billion unknowns, things become very unwieldy. And that's what I want to talk about. So why not stick to algebraic multigrid that I showed you? And there's a bunch of problems with this. The most important one is that these algebraic methods are based on sparse matrices. So you assemble a sparse matrix for the problem that you want to solve, and then the AMG method in some way constructs a hierarchy of matrices, again, sparse matrices, that help you to run a multigrid cycle. And I'll show you how the multigrid cycle works in a second. And the problem is that everything is stored as matrices, and the only thing you do is matrix vector products. That means that the arithmetic intensity is too low. So you access memory more than you actually do computation. That makes it quite difficult to exploit vectorization in the machine that we have today and multi-threading itself. I know you can run n MPI ranks on a machine with n cores, but vectorization is something that you miss out by doing this. And even with multi-threading, hyper-threading is really difficult to run with MPI, but if you use multi-threading, you can actually take advantage of performance. And another problem is that algebraic multigrid methods construct the hierarchy of matrices by just looking at the matrix structure, and that's very heavy in cost, setup cost, and causes a big communication overhead. So with more than a few billion unknowns, the setup for an algebraic multigrid is very slow and doesn't scale at all, in my opinion. it also does not take advantage of the geometric structure of the problem. And it's mostly good for Laplace-like problems. And you cannot exploit any PDE specifics that you have. Of course, it's easy to use, right? Because you can just use Triangulation, and basically I just have one function call that says, okay, run it, give me a preconditioner, and it does. But again, in today's computers are very parallel, are fast at doing computation, and are really slow in doing memory access. And even worse if you go to a GPU. But here, a standard node on, for example, this is on Frontera, you can run 900 parallel floating point, double precision floating point operations at the same time, and you are not exploiting these if you run with sparse matrices. You are basically at 1% peak, something like that, based on that. So 99% of the processor doesn't do anything because you have sparse matrices. That's the summary. And we can do better, and I don't want to say too much detail in here. You can do it in a flexible way with adaptivity, with everything. And what you need to do is you need to get away from matrices, basically, because even in the future, it gets more. We will have more cores with less memory bandwidth. And so what we need, I think, in my opinion, is higher order methods because they have more intensity. We need matrix-free operations where we don't build matrices, because if you store a matrix, you're slow. And we probably also need to exploit hyperthreading and threads, because you might not be able to afford on many core machines to use MPI. That's debatable. We often run MPI only, but this is also something to keep in mind. And it's not really possible with an algebraic multigrid method that looks at matrices. There are hybrid ones that don't do this, but in reality, we want to get away from this. And what I'm talking to you about today is a paper we submitted last year. It's still in review, which explains all of this. And I see it as a follow-up and the work I did the last 10 years in making this work. And geometric multigrid, I hope you know what it is, or multigrid in general, is one of the few methods for elliptic PDEs to solve problems in O of n time, where n is the number of unknowns. And we also wanted to scale up in parallel. And the idea is that you have a hierarchy either of matrices with algebraic multigrid, or you have a hierarchy of levels, meshes, cells, and do this geometrically. And so that's what geometric multigrid is. And the operations we do is restriction, prolongation, and smoothing. And you get this V cycle. And you can show that for certain problems, this is optimal in terms of complexity. And algebraic multigrid also does it. And I don't know of anything else that does it for a finite element discretization that for an elliptic operator, at least, right? There's certain problems where you can do things, but for finite elements, elliptic problems, only multigrid can do that. And that's required to scale to a large number of unknowns, right? And geometric multigrid constructs a sequence, again, of also linear operators in a way, based on coarser and coarser meshes. And this has been done for a long time, and I'm not going to go into too much detail what a smoother is. A smoother can be all kinds of operations. So it can be a simple thing as a Richardson iteration or a Jacobi, where you use the diagonal of your matrix. Or what is more interesting, and people actually try to do, is to use Schwartz-like operators, where you solve a sequence of either additive or multiplicative local operators that together form the global operators. And that's also what we do inside deal.II to get good performance. There's Chebyshev variants, there's sequential versions or parallelized sequential versions, if you know Gauss-Seidel or SSOR. The V cycle is a recursive thing, and I hope you've seen this before. You smooth, you transfer, you recursively call V cycle, you smoothen on the way back, and then this is your V cycle operator with the coarse solver there. Again, I don't want to go into too much details because I don't have ages to tell you about this, but and if you're not an expert in geometric multigrid methods, then that's probably not too helpful. And if you know what I'm talking about, then it's also not too interesting what I tell you here. But you need these operators, right? And you can do it in an abstract way where you don't tell anybody what the restriction is, what the smoother is, what the coarse solver is. This also works on adaptively refined meshes. It's a little bit more complicated. And my colleague Guido Kanchat, who is in Heidelberg, discussed a long time ago how it's done in deal.II. So this is also 10 years ago. That's when I started looking into multigrid methods, because again, this was when I was starting to look into larger problems. And you can use it for all kinds of methods with local smoothing for adaptivity. It's technical because you have to figure out what to do on hanging nodes, etc. So now what's the idea? And again, this is described in this paper if you're curious, and I'm trying to summarize this in 3 slides, so bear with me. The idea is the same that we did on Tuesday. We want something that is, from the perception of the user, equivalent to a sequential geometric multigrid that does this V-cycle, conceptually, obviously. So transfers are logically a multiplication with a sparse matrix that transfers from one level to the next. Of course, I don't have to build a matrix, but logically speaking, is a multiplication of a matrix. I can do this in parallel. A smoother is typically a set of sequential operations that I can do in parallel. Of course, if I have a sequential smoother like a Gauss-Seidel, I cannot run it in parallel, but any kind of additive smoother I can easily run. So if I do a Jacobi smoother, I can do all these operations on each processor, on each of their own cells. And the core solver, I can do a direct solver on a single node. I can do an iterative solver without a preconditioner, or I can use an algebraic multigrid, for example, right? So this has been done for many years. And what do I need for this? I don't need much, right? I need the infrastructure to do this, and I need it abstracted in a high level that is easy to use. But the only thing that's left is kind of a distribution of cells and unknowns on each of my refinement levels, right? If I have that, then most of the pieces are in place and I can run it. And this is what we did in this paper. It's a relatively simple version that uses, in this example, so on the left here is an adaptively refined mesh with the Z curve that comes out of p4est, and I have to distribute the coarser level cells. So p4est only cares about these 4 cells here and not of the parent of these 4 cells, which in this case we assign to the red processor based on a first child rule. So the first child, so this is the p4est tree representation of this. So if I have 4 cells on the finest level, I just assign the first parent to be the owner of this and the first parent of the owner of this. It's a very simple idea, but yeah, I don't want to go into too much detail because I don't have too much time today to talk about this, right? If you're curious, we can talk about it in the second session, but what I do here is I distribute the work on the coarser levels. And so this is how it would look like, right? So this is an adaptively refined L shape. That's actually the mesh that we saw a minute ago when I ran the computation, right? And this is the view from the 2 different processors, right? So gray is I don't care about. So this is the light blue processor, and then it shows the ghost layer, and then all the assignments of the unknowns on all the levels. So this is in addition to what p4est does, because p4est only gives it to me for the quadrants for the leaf nodes. And we construct the whole hierarchy of the local mesh and then assign ownership on each level. And then we can run a geometric multigrid method in parallel with all the ingredients that we have, right? And this is used as a preconditioner to solve this. Lots of magic, lots of things I didn't talk about, but if you see the pictures, I hope you can understand and believe that you can run this with adaptivity in parallel using p4est, and I can construct a solver that does this multigrid V-cycle. And you might ask how that works, and we can talk about results. But one more thing, I told you at the beginning, I don't want matrices, right? So what we do often is we use matrix-free multigrid method. And these matrix-free methods, you can read about it there. Martin Kronbichler and Katharina Kormann, both in Munich, wrote about this a couple of years ago. And interestingly, Martin was also on the original p4est deal.II paper from 10 years ago. So he continued down towards efficient methods on a single node. And what you do is, instead of accessing the ith entry of a matrix vector product, is that you on the fly integrate the effect that U has on the matrix A without storing the matrix A. And this has only been possible to do for a couple of years to be efficient, because you have to do integration using quadrature on the fly. And this is today faster than assembling a matrix and then doing a matrix vector product. It's actually faster than doing a matrix vector product, not even counting the assembly. Just the matrix vector product on the fly, if you are smart about it, is faster. And it needs tensor structure for the finite element spaces, the basis functions, the quadrature. It needs BLAS routines for dense linear algebra for the tensor structure on each cell. And what it gives is high arithmetic intensity, and it allows us to do vectorization and us to exploit multi-threading, hyper-threading if you're interested in the situation where it matters, and checks off all the boxes of what I told you in the beginning, why matrices are bad. That's why I went geometric multigrid, right? And I'm combining adaptive refinement multigrid methods with p4est parallel distribution of meshes with matrix-free operators. And these three ingredients had to come into place to make this work and make this effort worthwhile. Without all three ingredients, we couldn't make it work. If one of them is missing, we would still be at the case where we were 10 years ago, where many simulations are being done with. And so let me show you some results. So these are the earliest results with deal.II from 2017. These were also done by Martin. And you can see strong and weak scaling for a Q3 element with continuous and discontinuous elements on the left and the right. And you see strong scaling up to 150,000 processors. I think this is on the SuperMOOC too. And so this was three years ago. So this is quite nice. And so the strong scaling is each line, and then the weak scaling is the dashed line jumping to the next bigger problem size. And the biggest one here solves a Laplace problem. Okay, it's the simplest problem you can solve with 200 billion unknowns on an adaptively refined mesh. And this is quite impressive to solve problems in the order of a second. And this is only possible, again, matrix-free geometric multigrid. In 2017, we were actually doing this, I think, without adaptivity. So I was wrong when I just said adaptively. These were the results without adaptivity. And then since then, we have been building things with that in mind, and the algorithms that do these operations also with hanging nodes with adaptivity. And I'll show you the results in a minute. But this is what we have been doing. And this is an order of magnitude bigger in number of processors and orders of magnitude bigger in numbers of unknowns. And this required a lot of other work, right? Underlying is p4est again, but it required a lot of effort on the deal.II side to scale things. This is our handwritten linear algebra. It's handwritten matrix-free operators. It's handwritten multigrid method, etc. And now I want to show you that we can also run this in for more complicated problems. So this is a variable viscosity Stokes problem. This is computations that my postdoc did, and we submitted the paper, which came out of his thesis at the end of last year, still in review. And so this is variable viscosity benchmarks for Stokes, and we do have an efficient matrix-free block-based solver for variable viscosity Stokes. Not new, but new inside deal.II because we run adaptively on a large scale. And I don't have a lot of time left, so let me just close with this. This is weak and strong scaling results in deal.II with adaptive refinement for a Stokes problem on Frontera with 100,000 cores, solving a Stokes problem in the order of 10 seconds. With up to 200 billion unknowns, and show good, strong, and weak scaling up to the largest problem size that we were allowed to run. And again, orders of magnitude bigger than 10 years ago. And this is the culmination of all the ingredients that I laid out to you today. And I think I'm getting close to out of time, so I will stop here. This is the material that I prepared that I wanted to show you. And in the second session later today, I will be there, and I can show more demos, and I can explain more things. And we also have more time to do questions. So there are two questions. I will very quickly answer them, Karsten, if you're okay with it. I can elaborate on matrix-free methods, but I will do this in the second session. And yes, there's a paper for crack propagation to do it matrix-free. I can point you at the paper. I was not involved in that paper, but yes. we do this in deal.II. This is the third session of the 3 sessions that I'm going to talk about deal.II and p4est and how they interact. And just to remind you, in the first session, I told you about how we interact with p4est and how you can basically solve things in parallel and how we iterate and interact with p4est. Then in the second session that just finished, we talked about geometric multigrid. And I finished with this slide here showing that for a complicated problem, so not a trivial Laplace problem, we can, with the help of p4est and geometric multigrid and matrix-free implementations, efficient implementations, get to really large problem sizes and really large number of processing cores. That kind of summarizes already the interplay between p4est and deal.II and how the things work. So we can talk, if you guys want, about exercises. We can talk about other questions that you might have. And I also have a few more slides prepared for one other topic that I would like to mention that might be of interest for you. But maybe we can start. With looking at if there are things to talk about. And I think Sean and at least one other person, I think, had some questions earlier that I might not have answered well enough. So if you want to, there's now some opportunity. If you don't have anything specific, I can also just go into detail on one of the things that I talked about and go back and maybe show some more code if that's of interest. Just let me know what seems appropriate.
Hi, Timo. It's Sean. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi. Yeah. So I don't know if this is the right time, but yeah, I was just trying to get a better sense of sort of how iterating over cells is the same and how it's different with deal.II and then sort of in p4est directly, because I know that deal.II, you obviously have a very large user data type thing that you're interested in, and you represent the distributed mesh in a slightly way, I guess, as p4est does with only regards to storing the leaves. And so, yeah, I guess that's sort of the general area of my question. I can try to formulate things more specifically, but I was wondering if you might just, yeah, say a quick word about sort of how these different notions of iterating over the mesh, yeah, sort of work.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Sure, I can do that. That's an interesting question for sure. So let me just pull up one of these pictures here, and they, again, to summarize what we have here is the top row is the active cells, right? So the cells that p4est knows about, the quadrants p4est knows about, and where you want to compute your solution. So this is an L-shaped domain with the cells close to the reentrant coordinate refinements once more. The picture on the left is the logical view of the global mesh that does not exist anywhere. And then on the right, the two views from the blue and from the red processor, respectively. So they know about one layer of ghost cells, and they don't know about the other cells, right? So that's why it's grayed out. And in this example, it is not too interesting because there's actually not the case that I can coarsen a lot because it's far away from my region of interest. But I picked this example because here I could actually show, and the goal here was to show the multigrid hierarchy. We get to this in a second. But obviously, this is done in a way that I'm never storing the global mesh. So maybe the original example from the first day might be of more of interest. So this picture here. So you actually see that we don't create the cells. So processor red does not have these cells stored, right? So this is scalable. There is, because in deal.II we enforce 2-to-1 balance over the edges. There is these gray or white cells here that are artificial cells that are actually stored, but this is typically a small amount compared to the actual cells that we have. And we want this because we want to store the refinement starting from the coarse mesh that every processor has. So we're constructing basically these two things next to each other, right? So the p4est knows what are our cells, and deal.II also knows what are our cells. And basically, p4est is then not used during most of the simulation, right? So we go into p4est when we want to do a rebalancing, a save or a load, or if we want to do a refinement. But the rest of the simulation is completely decoupled from p4est. And you can argue whether this is the only way to do it or if it's the best way to do it, but this is how it is. So no iteration takes place during the simulation using p4est algorithms. So there is a distinction between them. And you can think of p4est as just an oracle that says, this is your mesh. That's kind of our philosophy in the simplest shape or form. That said, we use a few of the p4est algorithms. But now to get to your question, so the first part of your question is like, how is this different? The difference is that in deal.II, we actually store C++ objects that represent these cells. So there's a structure inside the C++ code, which is a cell. And then there are certain operations that I can do on that cell. So let me maybe pull up the documentation. So it's a little bit hard to understand because the functionality uses complicated template data structure. But let me just go to, so this is a cell accessor. So this is the thing that you get when you dereference an iterator. So you can iterate over cells. You saw this in one of the examples that I did. So if I go back to the tutorial program, for example, actually in this one I didn't do that, right? Let me go into the VM. This is also not the example where you can see it. So in this example, for example, we do so here we iterate, for example, over all active cells, and then we get a cell iterator. So the type of this thing is called an iterator. And then let me go back to this. So when you dereference the cell, so when you do cell arrow, then you get back an accessor. And with this accessor, you can operate on things. And to just give you an idea what you can do, you can ask whether it's at the boundary, you can refine it, you can ask whether it's flagged for refinement, you can ask it for material IDs or set material IDs. And you can go to the parent because we have the whole hierarchy available. So let me show you this. This picture again, or maybe this picture is even easier. If I'm sitting on this green cell here, I can ask for parent, and then I get an iterator that points to the parent. And I can go to the next cell, to the previous cell, to the parent, and I can also go to neighbors. So for example, there's a function, I don't know where it is. Yeah, accessing sub-objects and neighbors. So I can go to the child, I can go to the face, I can go to the neighbor on a particular face, and I can also ask, like, is my neighbor coarser? And if yes, like, how do I get back from the coarser neighbor back to myself, etc. And so there's also vertices. Actually, there's a hierarchy here. So this is for cells, and then the base class of this imports other function. And here you can ask other information. For example, you can go ask for diameter. You can ask what faces and lines and vertices you have. What is the center? And you can query all this information in a way. And what we actually store is, going back to this picture, is this hierarchy of cells and faces, etc. And these are C++ objects that you can access. And iterators allow you to iterate over these in whatever order and whatever means you need to. And And yes, you could iterate over cells also with p4est, but there's, I think, a richer interface and more information here. So if we wanted, we could have done like internally there's a p4est iteration happening, but this is more flexible, right? Because the user can decide when to go to the parent, when to go to anywhere else. And we store the hierarchy of cells for various reasons, right? So if you do finite element operations, you need to know how you operate on a parent. You need to be able for a multigrid to transfer solutions, etc. So there's a reason that we also allow things on not only active quadrants or cells. And that's what we do, and that's what we expose. So that kind of summarizes the difference. And again, the iteration is separate. That said, we use p4est iterate, for example, but not in the code that the user writes.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much. I think that's very clear. So I was thinking, like some of these flags, for example, like the material ID, of how to sort of do that in p4est itself. But I think, as you say, it's kind of a much more of a bare bones sort of infrastructure there. But because if I can take a little bit of time, the kind of use case I was thinking of was just a simple, to exchange some fluxes over faces, and there, it'd be I would think one way would be helpful to know who your neighbors are, and that's not immediately given in the p4est, but that is something that through the cell accessor you've explained is available to you in deal.II. And so anyway, but I was just curious about this data structure that's in p4est, and I understand now is not used in deal.II, but this p4est mesh type. And that seems to want to sort of locally return you to the Cartesian happiness. But at any rate, yeah. So I think you've addressed sort of the kind of thing I was getting at. So
okay.
But anyway, yeah. Thanks very much. Yeah.
Sure. I have not used the p4est mesh, and I have also not used the p4est interface to p4est. And both of them, in a way, as far as I understand, describe a similar way where you can, at a more higher level, iterate over objects. And that might be the thing for you to look at. So p4est has the unstructured mesh support using p4est, and it allows a lot more stuff you can do on the mesh. And then this p4est mesh, I haven't used it. And there's a lot of other stuff, for example, that explains why we need to do this. So let me just give one example why we care about us iterating in a different order. So to do an efficient multi-threaded assembly, we cannot use p4est in a multi-threaded safe way. And we also don't want to, because we don't necessarily want to depend on p4est. But what we, for example, do is that we grab all the cells that belong to this processor, and then we run a graph coloring algorithm within this to detect which of the groups of, for example, faces, or so pairs of cells or individual cells, we can operate on at the same time without a mutex or without a lock. So we color it in, let's say, 5 different colors, and then we can run in a multi-threaded way on a subset of these cells without any synchronization in a multi-threaded efficient way. And this is even interesting if you don't do multi-threading, because we do vectorization. So our iteration for the matrix-free method iterates over 4 or 8 cells in one thread with SIMD operations at the same time. So 4 cells are always grouped together and are iterated over in a chunk at the same time. And using SIMD instructions, all the integration, whatever operation you want to do are done in parallel. And p4est does not do that. So the p4est iterate whatever operations are just that, right? It's simple scalar code.
Okay. Yeah. No. I mean, there's different tools for different purposes, so that makes a lot of sense.
Yep. Okay. So I got a question about from Daniel about DOF handler. So the only place I think where we use p4est iterate, let me try to see where I have my window. why has p4est iterate. Let me go to deal.II. So yes, so here is a little bit of code that I just found in the break, where we use p4est iterate, but it's a tiny amount of work that we do to query the ghost layer. So there's a function here that we call. Let me try to find where we actually do this. So we have a class called find ghosts, and we run p4est iterate over it. And then in the function itself, we construct the cell back from the quadrant, so we know where our deal.II cell is. And then we grab the subdomain ID basically from the p4est in this find operation, and then we store this information, for example. So this is one place where we actually use a p4est algorithm. But then to get to your question, the question was how do we use it in the DOF handler? And the answer is not at all. So the compute vertices with ghost neighbors is which of my vertices of my mesh have ghost cells, and what are the ghost cells, and how do I get to these, basically. So no, we are not using p4est algorithms for a lot of stuff. Basically, there is the reconstruct my local mesh from the p4est using callbacks. And we do this by being able to convert from a quadrant to a deal.II cell and from a deal.II cell to a quadrant. And that allows us to construct the local mesh and the ghost layer. I think I can try to find the, so here's the data transfer. So this is the distributed tria.cc. And the thing I was going to try to find was, what was it called? Copy local forest to triangulation. So this is the after the p4est got refined, this is how we reconstruct the mesh. And let me go and before, let me just finish all the stuff. So I can construct the ghost layer, and then I go through my course cells. So begin 0 to end 0 is the course mesh. And then I set all the subdomain IDs, so that's the ownership. I set them to artificial or invalid. And then I loop over my course cells. And then I ask p4est, does this tree exist locally? And if not, I delete all my children and set the cell ID to, I don't know. And if the tree exists locally, so this is a, this is a p4est comparison. And if it exists locally, I'm going to create a quadrant, p4est quadrant, and then recursively compare my tree of cells to the p4est and recursively query whether I need to coarsen, refine, and the ownership, and so on. And when I'm done with this, overall core cells, then I match quadrants in the ghost layer. So I take the ghost layer and do the same thing. And with the ghost layer, I know what ghost cells to create and refine. And then I'm going to check whether I need to loop. So then I execute coarsening and refinement. That's the sequential version of this. And then I repeat this until the p4est and the deal.II mesh agree. And after, so while mesh changed, I keep doing this, and then I'm done. And then I have the local reconstruction. And I guess the p4est iterate is not used in this case. It's used for some other identification that we need to do for the ghost neighbors. And yeah, it doesn't make much sense to show you what we do inside the DOF handler. I kind of explained how it works. I'm not sure if browsing through a lot of code is super useful. If you have a more specific question, I can try to answer it. So the routines are deal.II only, and there's nothing in that uses p4est, and it's C++ code that iterates over data structures and uses MPI to exchange information, basically. That's what it boils down to. All right. I don't see any other question at this point. So maybe I can just...
Sorry, Timo, sorry to interrupt you. I have something that's a little bit different, but just on this notion of interacting with C code, right, from sort of a C++ type hierarchy. And so I saw in one part of the code you have a reinterpret cast. Right? I was just wondering if you might say anything about sort of type safety, memory management, and at the same time having to use p4est, which uses these void pointers, C-style void pointers rather heavily. So if you had any thoughts on how those interact, interact. Thanks.
Yeah, so I don't particularly like C code for high-level complicated logic. And you can tell from the interface that p4est provides, it is not easy to use. And it uses, like you said, void pointers because C code cannot have callbacks with correct types, right? So you pass in a function pointer, and then you have a user pointer, and then that's a class, and then in your callback, that's what's happening, right? So you call a global function, and the global function has a pointer, and so I'm reinterpreting this as in a different object, and then I can operate on this, right? So here's the user data pointer. That's actually a static cast. That's back to actually the type of object that you have. So this is what I kind of want is here I have this small helper class, right? And I want to operate on this, but in reality I have to do this magic of casting stuff. So that's one of the reasons that the interface for how we use p4est is tiny. You notice that this is probably the only interaction with p4est directly, and that's a couple hundred lines of code, right? There's not a lot of stuff that we like to expose. Nobody in deal.II actually uses the p4est internally, and most of these things are not super easy to use, and it doesn't fit very well to a high-level C++ abstraction. You want to write code that is dimension independent, and immediately if you use p4est, you cannot do that. So that's why we have this these p4est wrapper types where we abstract away basically the different types that p4est exposes and structure them based on dimension. Same with the functions that we call, because I mean, if I call p4est safe or p8est safe, I don't really care, right? In the C++ code, I can write the code once and then operate on these things. So I'm not a big fan of C codes, and I see value in p4est, but we don't want to touch it in all over the place and have it all over the code. That's why we specifically did it this way, that void pointers and stuff does not transfer to the user side. So the user never gets to see any of this. And it's error prone, right? It's difficult to use. It requires being careful with allocations and stuff like this. I'm not saying, hey, you don't have to worry about allocations when you write C++, but you can make things much easier to use and at the same time also stay performant. So for example, this does not have any overhead that I define new types that change what they actually contain and what they are based on the dimension. But it's not exposed to the algorithm itself that operates on these objects. There's no reason that I should have to do an if-def 2D, if-def 3D, whatever, because you can actually hide this in a very neat way. So for example, if I go back to the p4est wrapper example, I don't know whether.
I'll just say I've long been a convert to the dimension-independent templating from deal.II, so I definitely appreciate that.
Yeah. So we don't hard code this algorithm twice because all of this is dimension-independent, right? And if I had to if we don't do it this way.
And just sorry, I don't want to monopolize, but just on this issue, because the ghost layer, right, is something variable and something you don't know what it's going to be before it's refined, right? The number of elements in the ghost.
Sure.
Yeah, and so you get a nice like a raw pointer that says this is the beginning of in whatever user data you have associated with these quadrants that begins here. Now, so that's like exactly the kind of thing that I was thinking about. How would you or how do you do that sort of safely in C++? Because from the p4est interface, which is in C, as we know, it just gives you this raw pointer. And so that seems like the kind of place where it would be easy, if one is not careful, to allocate something and forget to deallocate it or something like that. So yeah, so but I don't know, is there a place in deal.II where you, because I understand that your memory management model is going to be much more involved, right, than just this simple little user pointer that you associate with p4est. But maybe just then the short form is, how do you deal with the dynamic allocation of these ghost elements, which could be variable depending on the mesh of it.
So the interface to, like, for example, when you query the ghost layer is in a way I already showed you here, right, where I grab the quadrant and I iterate over them, and I have these offsets and hard-coded indices and operations, and I actually have to do static casts, right, because these are void pointers. Yeah. This is not nice, but on the other hand, all these algorithms fit on one page, and we had to write them at some point, but this code hasn't been touched in 10 years, I think. So the good news is, yeah, I mean, you make it work once, and then hopefully nobody has to touch it again, because you have a C++ representation that gets away from the low-level part of this. That's the part about interfacing with p4est. The data storage inside deal.II, of course, we have to pay attention to this as well. So we are not going to, if you think about this picture of cells with ways to go to parents and children and neighbors, etc., it's not like we use the heap to allocate each different cell individually and have pointers pointing to everything. That would be hilariously inefficient. That's not what we do. But but we can provide a view of that to the user as if that is the case. And I know, for example, how the storage is done in deal.II for this example here. The triangulation is the whole object, and it stores the different kinds of things, for example, the ownership of a cell or the vertices of a cell, in separate structures, and they are grouped by level, and then over the objects. So it's like it is not one array of structures, but it is structures of arrays where appropriate. And this also allows to pack cells very efficiently. So all cells on one level are in a contiguous memory range in one allocation. And I just know how to jump between the cells based on very few information. So for example, we store the parent index of the cells in a separate place inside the triangulation, and there's very little information I need to know because, for example, all of these 4 children here have the same parent, so I only need to store that information once. Or if I have a cell, then I also know where my children are because I just need to know where the first child is, and then I know where all the children are, and so forth. So there's a lot of low-level tricks that are happening. I'm not saying we do a lot of bit packing in that sense, because we still use std_vector, for example, to do the allocations. We don't use new and delete a lot because that's not safe. But we do pay very conscious effort in how we pack and access the data. So it's not just C++, everything kind of magically works if I just do randomly allocate stuff, but the user doesn't need to care.
Okay, great. Well, I think I'm satisfied. So thanks very much. I appreciate the insight. And C++ is a powerful tool for good and evil. So
that's right. You have to wait for it to compile, for example.
Yeah, for example, yeah. Thanks a lot.
Mm-hmm. Timo, can you discuss a little bit, you kind of touched upon going from, say, 1 billion degrees of freedom or 10 billion up to 100 billion. I'm at that stage now where I'm hitting the limits at 10 billion with, say, like my checkpoint file is, I'm using p4est to checkpoint my data because I have it stashed in there for now. But of course, I'm over allocating, and now my checkpoint file is 100 to 200 gigabytes. And so I'm running into those limitations at that level now. What else do you see going up to 100 billion or more degrees of freedom, and what recommendations, I guess, abroad?
Yeah. So let's see. One of the first things that I would like to get back to is maybe the slide, and I can talk while I'm on the slide. I did this on Tuesday, is you need to think a lot harder about distributing storage and efficient parallel algorithms. So I can tell you a few stories about what has changed in deal.II in the last couple of years, because things are not good and not efficient, or were not good and not efficient. Let me start with the checkpointing questions that you had. The model of relying on p4est for the storage of data that varies depending on what cell you're on, if you do like an HP computation or whatever, we ended up basically writing our own solution for the part that is not so structured that it easily fits into the p4est. I can show you that first, and then I can continue more about general things about deal.II that I noticed. So if I go, there's a distributed triad.cc, and there is a data transfer class. Let me try to find this. So this is the data transfer class inside deal.II. And this is a private helper class in the Triangulation that is dedicated to data transfer across partitioned meshes and to the file system. So this is the data transfer and the checkpointing, basically. And what we do is that we can pack and unpack data, and that we call the p4est save and load. And if I go to the implement, and so we have fixed data and we have variable data. So the fixed data is stored in the user data from p4est as needed. So we change the size to the appropriate size that the user needs at that moment, and then use p4est to either store or transfer or change. So for example, the very simple information that we need to store, we can store it in a fixed size. And then the variable size stuff we handle on our own. And so let me just go to this. I would just show you the high level of the class. So here's like you can register as a user to say, hey, I have a callback and I want to pack data. So you get called for every cell what data you want to pack in. And then depending on, there's two kinds, and there's the fixed size and there's the variable size. And what we do here is we tell you whether the cell is refined or coarsened and pack all the data. And let me try to find the actual code. Blah, blah, blah. So we do. So we built the buffers. And this is not the interesting function. So execute transfer might be interesting. So we generate p4est transfer and transfer the information directly. And I think, I guess for variable size transfer, we actually use the p4est, also the transfer fixed to transfer the sizes. And then after we have done that, we figure out a way how to transfer information. Yeah, so we do a transfer custom with the variable size data, for example. But I think for the save routine, we actually use our own. I didn't write this code, so this is the save, and here is actually low-level MPIO calls, basically, right? So we write. So it looks like the fixed size is also no longer stored in the file for handled by p4est, but actually handled individually. So we just write with MPIO. So that's the part about the checkpointing. The more general question that you have is like, what do you notice when you go to larger problems? And let me just open up notes so that I can write down things. So the first thing is the 32-bit unsigned int limit. And this is kind of difficult because writing, so if the global number of cells or the global number of unknowns or the global number of whatever information you have exceeds 32 bits or 4 billion unknowns. This was hard work in deal.II because at the beginning we were just using 32-bit indices for global information. And for example, half a year ago, I fixed a bug where we were having, if you have a block vector with, let's say, a velocity and a pressure, and the velocity block by itself was more than 4 billion unknowns, then one of the operations to compute some kind of local index into the second vector in one of the vector operations used a 32-bit integer for this representation. And so the indices were computed incorrectly and the code crashed. But only if you had more than 4 billion velocities. And of course, most of the code was already written to work correctly, and we have been solving Laplace problem for a long time. But there can be many bugs in there, and it's really difficult to get right and to fix all of these issues. The global communication is another thing. We had small routines in the setup that would do an MPI all-to-all. And you would think that it's harmless. So you would just exchange one number between each of the processors. But if you have 100,000 processors, then a simple MPI all-to-all is going to be a bottleneck. It's going to take, I don't know, 10, 20, 30 seconds or a minute to do this, which used to be at 1,000 cores and at 1 billion unknowns, is like, it doesn't even show up in your profile, right? So you have global communication of this kind that is problematic. So we got rid of all of these in all different places. That was necessary to scale to 100,000 cores efficiently. And that was also hard. The other thing that was quite hard was getting non-blocking communication correctly. So a standard procedure for an algorithm is the following. Find out who to send to, then send all packages to my neighbors, and then let me go into an org mode. And then from there is then wait and receive messages until done and process. So this kind of loop happens a lot, right? So you prepare all your sent data and then you keep receiving and processing data, but you need to know how many packages are going to come. And this can be complicated because you can also have non-blocking communication during non-blocking communication. And that does happen. And getting these things correct is really difficult. So for example, I can start a non-blocking communication, and once I'm done, I'm starting the next non-blocking communication. But somebody else might still be in the first non-blocking communication, right? If I already received all my neighbors. And so there's a lot of synchronization bugs that can happen. And typically, I mean, these can only happen, also can happen earlier, but for us, most of these only happened at scale, because at scale, you can have the situation where processors are way faster than other processors. So you have to be really careful in doing these operations. And then I guess everything about distributed storage, right? So at the beginning, we for example, we used to have an array that for each processor stores like the number of DOFs that the processor has, right? So we had like this. We had an array duplicated on each machine, so that I know how many degrees of freedom a processor has. Well, it turns out that's a bad idea, because if you have 100,000 other processors, you need to get all the information, going back to the all-to-all. But even if you have it, this is megabytes and megabytes of data that you actually don't need, right? And typically don't need, but some algorithms are much easier if I know how many unknowns everybody has, right? So for example, if I have an unknown X with index X, and I know from every processor how many unknowns they have, then I actually know who the owner is for any degree of freedom, which might be helpful, right? But we cannot afford to do that. So a lot of bug hunting, and I think the thing that was the most so on the non-blocking communication, I fixed several bugs in the last couple of months. The global communication, we removed a lot of these in the last year, and yeah, maybe there are even still bugs. I still have one bug to find out in a certain situation where something hangs, and I assume it's one of these bugs. And the hardest part here is that C++ is a lot better with finding bugs during compilation than C is, because I'm not doing any casts, I'm not doing any weird void pointer magic, but still, it's very easy to get these things wrong, because there's the implicit conversion from 32-bit to 64-bit integers, for example, and that immediately gets you, and you have to basically look through all the code that works. And I guess another challenge is that testing is hard, right? So I need to benchmark, and I had problems where I was benchmarking the large runs, and stuff takes minutes or half an hour to run, and it's really difficult to time and measure and debug. Things hang at random places, right? I had attached to GDB on Frontera running on, I think, 20,000 cores. So I spin up a computation and then log into the nodes and actually attach a debugger to see where it hangs, because there's some kind of deadlock. It's worth it to design abstractions. So if you write everything as low-level MPI send manipulating packages, then it's very easy to get these things wrong. So there's many places in our code where we do this operation. And if there's a high-level debugged version of this, then it's much easier to get things correct. And it's much easier to make sure that there's no bugs rather than checking every single place over and over. So my advice would be to design abstractions that help you with typical communication patterns that you have to do and typical computations. And the hard part is unstructured and weird communication that you have to do, I would say. And then the low-level fiddling of bits and serialization and saving and storing and retrieving these flags. I think that is about the main things that I worked on that come to my mind right now that are difficult to do and that are hard to get right in the large scale. I mean, it helps to think about things ahead of time, but a lot of deal.II was written when we were not thinking about more than 4 billion cells and problems like this.
Yeah, I've run into a number of issues you've already highlighted. So the 32-bit that popped up when we were doing a wind turbine wake simulation, and I was calculating to check a simple L2 norm of the residual vector. And yes, I've already overflowed and got a NaN. I was like, why is the simulation crashing, right? That's my one signal. And I notice, oh, okay, we're running up to this 4 billion limit, and noticing, oh, yeah, okay, that's what's happening, right? So like I've already started to experience a number of things just like you have. So, yeah.
And it's frustrating. I mean, I've spent hours on this, and it's yeah. Somebody else writes some new code while I am debugging the old one, and so the bugs get introduced faster than I can fix them to get to a version that runs. That was the situation for me. To get to the picture that I showed you with the large runs, I basically spent months on this and fixing bugs. Okay. I have a few slides that I wanted to show, so let me just do this because we have 10 minutes left, and as soon as I'm done, we can call it a day.
We have a question on the chat. It's about example of use staggered grids.
Oh, I didn't see it because I didn't scroll down. No, finite element people don't use staggered grids. So staggered grids is a finite difference methodology. Finite element people define different finite element spaces on each cell. So we don't do anything staggered. I would suggest, if you're interested in finite difference and staggered grid, or finite volume, I guess that's true, then maybe the PETSI wrappers are of interest because I think they support that, but I'm not quite sure. So yes, in finite volumes you kind of also have this, but in finite elements, you define different finite element spaces. So think of, for example, a staggered grid for a Stokes problem where you define on the x and the y velocity on different shifted meshes for a staggered grid for finite differences. For finite elements, you use a correct higher order polynomial space that would be kind of equivalent to this, but more flexible to arbitrary meshes, curved, whatever. So we don't do that at all. Okay. I want to mention a few things. How we run deal.II as a project. And I have 3 slides and I have a few minutes to do that. So I thought this might be interesting for you. So that's why I'm covering it here. So we run deal.II as a community project. It is developed in the open. There's no private development, there's no private meetings, but each of us, the currently 11 principal developers, I'm one of the 11, and many user contributors work, discuss, review everything. And there are several pull requests merged every single day. So deal.II is a very active project in that sense. And I think this is a really good model because our focus is to build a user/developer community. Basically, we do this, but we need help. And what we need is other developers. How do we get other developers? Well, we attract users, and then we trick the users and transform them into developers themselves, and then hopefully give back more and more. So that's the logical reason to go with an open source model, right? I don't want to implement everything. And so what you actually need to do is, if you want to be successful, is you need to put effort into this fact that you need to attract users and that you need to transform them into developers. You need to make it as easy as possible for users to become users and then for users to become developers. And this is a topic that is dear to my heart and that I thought a lot about with my colleague Wolfgang. And we wrote a paper about it if you want to read it. So the question is, what makes computational software successful? And one thing is to say, well, they're successful if they're good software and they solve a need, but there's also a lot of other reasons why software is successful. And you need to focus on documentation, testing, tutorials, and to welcome people and to work with them. And that allowed us to grow deal.II as a community project. So I'm not saying every scientific project needs to be a community project, but one way to get to be a very large project is to basically run it similar to deal.II. And there's some advice for you to do that. And what can happen then is, some statistics here, is this is a statistic by quarter over years, how many active people are contributing to deal.II. And this might not be exponential growth, but this is certainly growth over the last couple of years. I don't have the up-to-date numbers from 2019 and 2020. This is an older slide, and the color doesn't matter here. That was for a specific project. But the interesting part is that we are trying to grow the number of contributors. And for the longest time, so for example, when I did my work on deal.II, it was between 5 and 10 people who interacted. So I wrote a lot of this code without it being thoroughly reviewed. And we are certainly well past this, right? So at this moment, nothing goes into deal.II that is not carefully reviewed. I cannot just put something in. And if I make a 32-bit, 64-bit mistake, it's likely that somebody else finds the mistake before it gets even in. And that also allowed us to grow the user community. So this is number of publications that use deal.II over the years. The later years are not quite complete because we have to go through papers. But this is also, I think, a nice trend where we kind of transitioned in about 10 years ago from a very developer-centered mode to something that is more inclusive and more welcoming. And then we have a lot more people working. So in the order of 200 publications a year is where we're currently at, of random people who do work with deal.II. And the cool thing for me is that I can look back and say, these people here, maybe half of them use MPI parallel computations with deal.II, run their science with it, and they use my wrapper of p4est inside deal.II to do this, right? This is kind of empowering and makes it really motivating to work on these issues, right? I'm not writing this code by myself. I'm doing this so that other people can use it and build on this. And let me talk about testing. So we have tens of thousands of tests in the tests folder of the deal.II repository that if I run it on my laptop takes hours to complete. We run continuous integration. You can see this here on GitHub at the bottom. On every pull request, we compile with Linux, with Clang and GCC. We compile on Mac OS. We compile under Windows with Visual Studio. We compile MPI and sequential version of deal.II. We check formatting of the code. We check that the documentation compiles without errors, and all of these kinds of operations, right? So for example, I opened up a pull request. I don't know if it's merged yet. I opened up a pull request this morning. It's a simple 2-line change. And so I guess I still have to change it because Daniel reviewed it and said I should sort these warnings alphabetically because it looks nicer. And you can see here the unit tests that were actually run, right? So there are several machines that ran and that computed these things. And I'm not quite sure why this tester failed. I might be able to look it up. So this is actually an infrastructure of machines that I have in my office that are purchased to run deal.II. The ones up here are the free integration that GitHub provides, but they are very limited. They have 2 cores, and I'm running in parallel on a lot more cores so that I can actually run the parallel tests. So we can actually look at this and notice here that I get the information that out of the 4,000 tests that this continuous integration runs, these 7 tests failed. And I can actually look up what they did. So I can go to tests. This is really nice. I didn't know that tests failed. It's kind of weird because I just added a compiler flag, but I assume that one of our tests actually violates this. Yeah. So one of our tests is now triggering this compiler error. And we should fix the test so that it compiles on all compilers, right? So that's how we do the development. And yeah, I do mistakes all the time, right? I opened a very harmless pull request this morning that just said, hey, you should compile with missing brace warnings under GCC by default. And suddenly this test that I didn't even run on my machine is failing. And now I have to fix this before my pull request gets merged. So I have the bar really high in knowing that the stuff that I do works. And it works in all kinds of configurations. This is not enough. We actually run nightly builds. There's a dashboard for this. We have extra machines that run 24/7, check out the current version, run all kinds of configurations. These are run by a colleague. And you can see that there's actually stuff broken here right now because we are not able to run with 0 errors in all configurations. So here's, for example, if you compile with Clang 10 with AVX2 on, with fast optimization, some of the tests are failing. Most of them are probably okay, but so 12,000 tests pass, but 40 fail. And then the question is, why do they fail? And is there actually something that matters that broke, or is there something else weird? In all kinds of configurations, different versions of libraries, different compilers. So there's a lot of testing going on that we do, a lot of machine and a lot of manpower behind this to check things, right? So here, this is a MacBook Pro that I have in my office that keeps compiling things with different compilers and checks, and here I can see what is going on. So if you run a community project, this is something you do need because you cannot check individual contributions that they work, and people break things all the time. So whenever I have a bug, I will write a test and I make sure that next time somebody breaks this, I will actually know that this is a problem. So this is my summary on what we do on the infrastructure side to run a community project successfully. And I would hope that other projects can use some of this. And I think p4est doesn't do a great job with all of these things. It's not all transparent who does what. I don't see tests. I don't see things run in that way. And it would help because it actually improves the project immensely, right? So deal.II by now is mostly run by users contributing. I don't write a lot of code these days. I review things, I manage projects, I bring in money, I hire people, but I'm not the person who writes a lot of the code. And so that's kind of the idea to scale up and to improve things is in my opinion, that's one way to do it, unless you get commercial money and run a commercial enterprise out of this. But you have to live with the fact that inexperienced users contribute to things like this. And I think it's 2 p.m. It's kind of the end of my presentation anyway. So I will check the questions and answers. And otherwise, I am more or less done with whatever I wanted to talk about. If you have questions about what I just showed you or other stuff, you're welcome to ask me. And if not, then we can call it a day.